Vitalism in imperialist Germany. Essence and function of vitalism. Vitalism or Lebensphilosophie was the dominant ideology of the whole imperialist period in Germany. But in order to appreciate properly the breadth and depth of its influence, we must bear clearly in mind that this philosophy, as such, was not so much a school or even a plainly defined subject, as was, for instance, Neo-Kantianism or phenomenology, but rather a general trend pervading nearly all schools, or at least influencing them, and its influence was constantly increasing. In the pre-war period, for example, only Simmel of the Neo-Kantians was a declared adherent of vitalism, whereas in the post-war period both Neo-Hegelianism and the Husserl school in its advanced stage became entirely guided by vitalism. In order to delineate in full the vitalist sphere of influence, we must step beyond the field of philosophy in the narrower sense of the term. On the one hand, they had an influence on all the social sciences from psychology to sociology, most especially historical studies, the history of literature and art. On the other hand, their influence extended far beyond the university campus. Precisely the more widely influential writings of freelance philosophers were decidedly vitalist very early on. This is not only to do with Nietzsche's constantly growing influence on wide literary circles. Relatively early, we also find similar echoes of Dilthey and Weininger, of Simmel and Rathenau, and of both in the Stefan Georg school. In the post-war period, virtually the whole of bourgeois philosophical literature that was being read by wider circles was vitalist. The cause of vitalism's universal effect can only be sought in the social and ideological situation of imperialist Germany. Naturally, vitalism was a general product of the imperialist period and had important representatives in different countries. But here, as elsewhere in this book, we shall confine ourselves to the specific features of German developments. Vitalism, as it emerged and evolved as a philosophical subject in the imperialist period, was a specific product of this age, an attempt philosophically to solve from the standpoint of the imperialist bourgeoisie and its parasitic intelligentsia the questions raised by social evolution, by the class struggle's new forms. Obviously, the philosophers concerned supported their arguments with the findings and methods of those thinkers of the immediate and more distant past, who had voiced ideas which tended in the same direction and appeared of importance to them. This was all the more so since the social circumstances under which philosophical propositions and methods arise will show, despite all the often qualitative changes, a certain continuity which must naturally be also reflected ideologically. In the present case, it was the ruling class's reactionary hostility to progress since the French Revolution which determined this continuity. In our earlier chapters, we attempted to show in detail how irrationalism's specific problems of methodology and content arose from an endeavor to lend philosophical support to the increasingly decayed rule of these classes. As far as these aims and means have some continuity, it is also present philosophically. Every period harks back to the past, to specific phases of past development, whenever and insofar as it seeks and finds in them analogies to its present needs. This all indicates that this continuity can only have a relative character. The ruling class's tendency towards conservation in opposition to the new forces hammering on the door is subject to perpetual social transformation. As I saw earlier, the first manifestations of irrationalist philosophy at the start of the 19th century arose out of a resistance by the exploiters of feudal absolutism to the general bourgeois progressive movement sparked off by the French Revolution. Only with Schopenhauer did the expressly bourgeois bias of this reactionary movement emerge, and it was, as we showed in the relevant chapter, a matter of historical necessity that his philosophy gained universal currency only after the defeat of the 1848 revolution. For the age between 1789 and 1848 was, in Germany, the age marking the mobilization and assembling of forces of the bourgeois democratic revolution. The leading reactionary class forces were still directed against the aspiring tendencies of bourgeois democracy. Only with the defeat of the 1848 revolution was the transformation completed. The result was the development of a bourgeois irrationalism, of an extreme philosophical reaction from the bourgeoisie's class standpoint, which served its own particular class interests. Hence the popularity of Schopenhauerian philosophy after 1848. The Battle of June had already revealed the bourgeoisie's new and true adversary, the proletariat, in armed combat, thereby causing the bourgeoisie to betray its own revolution. The appearance of the Communist Manifesto showed this adversary clad in all its ideological armor. From now on, bourgeois philosophy was no longer fighting against the remnants of feudal thinking, and for the establishment of a bourgeois society purged of such remnants. Instead, it allied itself to all reactionary forces in order to suppress the revolutionary working class. In the ideological field, of course, this process was a gradual one and had its contradictions. Only after the second great historic battle between bourgeoisie and proletariat, the Paris Commune, which already adumbrated the social transformation that would come about in the event of a proletarian victory, did Nietzsche conceive fully fledged the form of new bourgeois irrationalism in which all the trends in this change are clearly expressed. While demonstrating this in our Nietzsche analysis, we elucidated at the same time his relationship to Schopenhauer in philosophical historical terms, the shared class origin in the specifically bourgeois character of their irrationalism, and this notwithstanding Nietzsche's need to advance beyond Schopenhauer's conceptions philosophically. But the philosophy of the imperialist age entailed no instantaneous direct association with the founders and classics of irrationalism. This again has socio-historical reasons. A chief reason lies in the fact that the great social crisis expressed at the outset of the age in Bismarck's fall and the repeal of the anti-socialist laws quickly abated, and that the development of German imperialism up to the First World War presented, outwardly and superficially, a picture of prosperity without any deep-seated social crises. Of course, this was merely a surface impression. But it was in the imperialist bourgeoisie's interests to have this impression portrayed and propagated as a reality. And the imperialist parasitical intelligentsia from which the creators and readers of vitalism were recruited could carry this out all the more readily, because their social situation generally endowed them with a beneficial blindness in respect of impending social changes and incipient crises. Thus, very often, they could play their social role spontaneously and in good faith. Somehow, of course, this crisis-torn character of the collective condition did show itself in various ways. But a result of the leading thinker's social situation, it did so in the form of a cultural crisis, a crisis of culture pure and simple. Hence, the bourgeoisie was able to exploit this largely spontaneously engendered intellectual movement for its own class ends. It used it partly to divert attention from the economic social character of the objective crisis itself, and partly as an element of the general hostility to progress, of the tendency, already discussed and due to be discussed again later, to glorify Germany's social and political backwardness as a higher form of the state and culture. All this is also related to the fact that while the stimuli provided by Nietzsche played a major part in Vitalism's development before the First World War, here his influence was primarily that of the cultural philosopher. Only when the crisis of the imperialist system had become publicly apparent to all after the First World War did his extremely reactionary questions and solutions begin to exert an effect. This latency of the crisis supplies the link between pre-war vitalism and its immediate forerunners, the philosophers after the 1848 revolution. At the same time, it accounts for the important differences that existed between them. Post-1848 period saw the burial of almost the whole of post-Hegelian philosophy. Most of the survivors covered, at a varying pace, some resolutely and some hesitantly, the road leading from Hegel to Kant. To the bourgeoisie, it seemed as though they had landed in a period of unlimited capitalist prosperity and of true social security where nothing could weaken the confidence of bourgeois society. To be sure, this was also the time of the German bourgeoisie's unconditional surrender to Bismarck's Bonapartist monarchy. These motives determine the fact that, along with Schopenhauer's growing fame and the diffusion of a scientifically mechanistic, socially liberal, opportunistic materialism, a positivist agnosticist neo-Kantianism was becoming the dominant philosophy. Bourgeois social self-confidence and an imperturbable trust in the everlastingness of capitalist growth led to the rejection of universal questions and to the confining of philosophy to logic, epistemology, and at the most, psychology. This reflects, on the one hand, a belief that the development of economics and technology would solve all life's problems just like that. And on the other hand, the predominance of epistemology was intended to be a defense against such fantastic, excessive, unscientific aberrations as the German bourgeoisie had been forced to experience in the year of madness. This instrument of defense was chiefly leveled against the consequences of Hegelian philosophy. But gradually, as the German working class gained in strength and awareness and became better organized, this instrument was increasingly used to challenge its worldview. Here we find to a growing degree the social roots of the furious struggle, in the name of neo-Kantian agnosticism, against the unscientific nature of materialist metaphysics, but it was deemed sufficient to outlaw questions of Weltanschauung from philosophy. The need for a worldview only became explicit with the latent crisis in the imperialist period, and it was the central task of the vitalist philosophy which arose at this point to satisfy that need. It was that need which gave rise to the difference between vitalism and its immediate antecedents. We have already indicated the important external difference. Pre-imperialist German philosophy was largely a scholastic discipline, far removed from seeking a wide influence. Vitalism's sphere of influence, on the intelligentsia, on the other hand, far exceeded these bounds, and a change in the mode of presentation was both its precondition and its consequence. The growing acknowledgement of Nietzsche as a fully qualified philosopher, and not as a poet, is a symptom of this change. But at the same time, as we shall discuss in detail later, the agnosticist epistemological basis of philosophy remained intact. Now, how is this superstructural change reflected in vitalism's stand on such decisive problem complexes as dialectics and materialism? As we know, pre-imperialist German scholastic philosophy took a resolutely dismissive view of dialectics. On this, the now influential Schopenhauer and the positivist neo-Kantians agree. Dialectics are nonsense and unscientific in principle. The course of German philosophy from Kant to Hegel is a major aberration, a cul-de-sac of learning. Back to Kant must be philosophy's catchphrase. Admittedly, other tendencies emerge in the philosophical outsiders. Eduard von Hartmann, for instance, sought to create an eclectic synthesis of the late Schelling, Schopenhauer, and Hegel, while even the later Nietzsche occasionally referred to Schopenhauer's unreasonable animosity to Hegel, and so forth. But these tendencies remained episodic, all the more so because many vestiges of the pre-1848 period were concealed in Hartmann's eclectic views. In part to be SLRA, they were also in a specific sense an intellectual anticipation of the imperialist-vitalist position. They express, in Nietzsche's case, to particularly marked effect, the decisively altered social situation and its intellectual reflection. The neo-Kantians believed in the age of security that they could remove the new enemy, socialism, through hushing it up. They thought that Kantian agnosticism, as the sole scientific philosophical method, when combined with the categorical moral imperative to submit unconditionally to the Hohenzollern system, would wholly suffice to remove all ideological dangers. If therefore the idea of progress cropped up at all on the neo-Kantian liberal wing, it was purely positivist evolutionary, i.e. the idea was of progress within a capitalist system unaltered in either structure or content. Already, capitalist triumphs and their consolidation had long ago made this positivist evolutionism the dominant direction in the countries of the West. Prussian-tinged security produced its own particular German nuances. At any rate, from this standpoint, any movement of history by way of contradictions and antitheses appeared a pure unscientific absurdity. This theory of evolution could, especially since it was presenting itself as the theory of the revolutionary worker movement, be simply dismissed as a ridiculous utopia. How the experience of the disruption of such security affected bourgeois philosophical thinking, and how it radically altered all methodological attitudes in this respect, we have been able to trace in Nietzsche. Because Nietzsche clearly perceived the new enemy, the working class, For him, dialectics were no longer a theoretical problem which had long been settled on the academic plane. And that is what they meant to those of his contemporaries for whom this adversary was not so dangerous as to make its intellectual destruction their primary task. Hence they thought that they could wave aside with a superior gesture those forms of dialectics that had in fact been overtaken by historical events, whereby, to be sure, they totally misread the historical and objective meaning of even Hegelian dialectics. Similarly, we have shown that Nietzsche merely perceived the danger, merely apprehended the enemy, and did not really study its theory and praxis. With Nietzsche, therefore, there ensued no conscious wrangle-eyeing with dialectics such as we find in Schelling or Kierkegaard. All he did was to oppose materialist dialectics, historical materialism, with an irrationalist myth as his counterconcept. Granted, the fundamental structure of this conception corresponds to that of the earlier irrationalist opposition to dialectics. But as we have seen, even in its method, it was, in principle, anti-scientific, emotional, and irrationalist. As the philosopher whose thought anticipated the crisis of capitalist society in imperial times, Nietzsche only acquired real readers and a real following after this crisis became generally evident in society, i.e., after the First World War and the setting up in Russia of the first dictatorship of the proletariat. The history of vitalism in its relations with dialectics constitutes the ideological development which led from latent crisis to acute crisis. Hence this process advanced slowly, but with occasional jerks, before the First World War. Hence its development ran parallel with various sociological wrangles with Marxism. These, while aiming primarily at destroying Marxism scientifically, also attempted in part to incorporate its serviceable and suitably purified elements in the bourgeois view of history. And hence bourgeois philosophy harked back to the Romantic era, to Kant's successors, as well as to Hegel and so on. All these tendencies are, very distorted, reflections in thinking of the same fact, namely that even during the time of what we have called their latency, the contradictions in social developments were already emerging so publicly that it became impossible to ignore them, as previously, with a show of academic hauteur, but the ensuing controversy was most half-hearted. Nobody wanted a rupture with the immediate forerunners. There was simply a desire to level up philosophy in accordance with the philosophical needs that now existed for the aforesaid reasons. To a constantly increasing extent, it was becoming recognized that valuable allies could be found in the expressly reactionary irrationalist philosophy of the age before 1848, in the reactionary foibles of idealist dialectics. Thus, whilst preserving its epistemology, philosophy struck out beyond positivist neo-Kantianism in a reactionary direction. Here again we find an irrationalist reversal of objective progress as reflected in dialectics and their extension. And already it was, in essence, though not couched in the outward form of most controversies, a case of philosophically demolishing dialectical and historical materialism in this way. In this and the following chapter, we shall analyze in detail the growth of this development and those important stages in it that depended on the adversary's growth and activities. In the second place, the struggle against materialism also governed the philosophical development of imperialism. Thus, it was unable to detach itself from the epistemology of subjective idealism. It made no difference whether it was chiefly oriented towards Kant, as in Germany, or towards Hume in Berkeley. The unknowability, indeed the non-existence, the unthinkable nature of an objective reality, independent of consciousness, was the implicit axiom of every philosophy of this age. It is clear that here the age's need for a Weltanschauung came into conflict with the epistemological precondition of its own thinking. And at this point, vitalism appeared in an attempt to resolve the dilemma. It was very easy for it to adopt the dominant forms of modern agnosticism, for since the classic basic question of epistemology, the relationship between consciousness and being, was gradually shriveling and dwindling into the formula, understanding versus comprehended being, it was possible to initiate a critique of understanding, an attempt to surpass its limits without disturbing the foundations of subjective idealism. The key to all these difficulties, it was thought, could be located in the concept of life, especially if this was identified, as always in vitalism, with experience. Experience, with intuition as its organon and the irrational as its natural object, could conjure up all the necessary elements of Weltanschauung without renouncing de facto and publicly the agnosticism of subjective idealist philosophy and without revoking that denial of a reality independent of consciousness which had become crucial to anti-materialism. Outwardly, to be sure, this struggle now acquired other forms. On the one hand, the appeal to the richness of life and experience, as opposed to the barren poverty of the understanding, permitted philosophy to counter the materialist inferences from social and scientific developments in the name of a natural science, biology. On the other hand, the appeal to experience gave rise to a pseudo-objectivism, an apparent self-elevation above the antithesis of idealism and materialism. The tendency to be raised above the allegedly false dilemma of idealism and materialism was a universal endeavor of philosophy in the imperialist age. To the bourgeois conscience, both isms seemed compromised in various ways, idealism because of the sterile academicism of its advocates, and materialism chiefly because of its association with the worker movement. And it is worth mentioning that the new, dialectical materialism seldom cropped up in these debates. Materialism as preached by Marx was simply identified with the old materialism, and the latter philosophy's failure to grasp conceptually the new achievements of physics was interpreted as a failure of materialism in general. Thus, on the eve of the imperialist period, a philosophical third road came into being with Mach, Avenarius, and Nietzsche almost simultaneously. In fact, however, this amounted only to a revival of idealism. For whenever the mutual inseparability of being and consciousness is posited, there necessarily arises an epistemological dependence of the first on the second, which is idealism. As long, therefore, as the philosophical third road remained purely epistemological, it differed not at all or barely from the old subjective idealism. The actual problem of pseudo-objectivity arose only when this philosophy went beyond the purely epistemological sphere. For the age's need for a Weltanschauung demanded a concrete world picture, an image of nature, history, and man. Granted, the proposed objects can only be created by the subject in accordance with the prevailing epistemology, but in order to satisfy the need for a Weltanschauung, they must at the same time stand before us as objects of objective being. The central position that life occupied in the method of this philosophy, particularly in that specific form, wherein life is always subjectified into experience and experience objectified as life, allowed of such a swing between subjectivity and objectivity, one to be sure, that never stands up to a proper critique of knowledge. The tendency, its first marked occurrence was in Nietzsche, was reinforced when the idea of myth entered into philosophical conceptions. There can be no doubt that mythical objects are creations by the subject. On the other hand, the long historical survival of myths, their universal and unchallenged validity for wide cultural circles, gave rise to the uncritical illusion that, despite their subjective origin and the subject-bound nature of their validity, they might represent a special type of objectivity. And precisely as the result of the aforesaid swing between subjectivity and objectivity, the new central concept of philosophy further reinforced these illusions and gave them a fashionable accent. It seemed, though, it was the destiny of precisely this age, out of its experience of life and with new figures of a new myth, to restore coherence to a world become godless and ravaged through understanding, to make it meaningful and to make new perspectives discernible. In fine, the essence of vitalism lies in a conversion of agnosticism into mysticism, of subjective idealism into the pseudo-objectivity of myth. This mythical objectivism, behind which there always stood a subjectivist agnosticist epistemology, exactly matched the philosophical needs of the imperialist reaction. The general feeling prevailed that a period of great inner and external historical decisions was imminent. Hence, the need to say something substantial and positive, something philosophical about social developments, history and society, i.e., to surpass neo-Kantian formalism. In the intelligentsia, one can sense a constant growth of anti-capitalist attitudes. During the final Bismarck crisis, the time of the repeal of the anti-socialist laws, when the naturalist ferment was taking place in German literature, the vast majority of the young and gifted intellectuals, for instance, was to be found in the social democrat camp. Therefore, these tendencies had to be assimilated in the philosophical world outlook so as to combat the intelligentsia's socialist tendencies more effectively than was possible for ordinary reactionary ideology. With its contrast between the living and the dead, petrified and mechanical, vitalist philosophy took over the task of deepening all concrete problems to such an extent that they created a major diversion from these imminent social consequences. But the atmosphere that was threatening the reactionary forces in Germany by no means confined itself to a sympathy with socialism. By the eve of the imperialistic period, the Bismarckian compromise was already cracking in every joint of the structure of the German Reich. A need for reconstruction was universally felt, by the right as much the left. Reactionary historians and sociologists were making strenuous efforts to portray the Second Reich's backward political structure as historically outstanding, new and superior to Western democratic forms, and these efforts met with great success among broad sections of the intelligentsia. Vitalism came to their assistance philosophically. Its relativism effectively undermined the belief in historical progress, and hence in the possibility and value of Germany's radical democratization. The polar primal phenomenon of vitalism, the antithesis of the living and the petrified, could be readily applied to this problem complex, and could, on the philosophical plane, compromise democracy as something mechanical and petrified. Here we cannot do more than outline this important connection. We shall discuss later the historical role of German sociology, philosophy of law, history, and so on, insofar as they affect the problems under consideration. There is the additional point that the central position of experienced life in vitalistic epistemology necessarily nerd toward an aristocratic feeling. An experiential philosophy can only be intuitive, and purportedly it is only an elect, the members of an aristocracy, who possess a capacity for intuition. In later times, when the social contrasts emerged more strongly still, it was overtly stated that the categories of understanding and reason belonged to the democratic crowd, whereas the truly eminent appropriated the world only on the basis of intuition. Vitalism had in principle an aristocratic epistemology. All these motives, of which we have set down only the most important, contributed to the dominance of vitalism and to the inflation of its agnostic relativism into a new philosophy. At first, official scholastic philosophy and the state authorities adopted a skeptical attitude towards these tendencies. Only gradually did vitalism infiltrate the entire thinking of imperialistic Germany. Imperialistic vitalism's founder and most important forerunner, Dilthey, occasionally voiced sharply programmatic statements about this situation. He portrayed the major role that a philosophical Weltanschauung had played in bygone politico-social struggles. He went on to write, "A lesson for the politician." In turning away from ideas and their philosophical expression, today's state officials and our bourgeoisie may assume as lofty an air as they please. It signifies not a sense of reality, but their intellectual poverty. Not only naturally powerful feelings, but also a closed system of ideas, give social democracy and ultramontanism an advantage over the other political forces of our times. One we amend, in these studies, to trace in its main phases the development beginning at this point and ultimately leading in its consequences to National Socialist philosophy. Of course, the line we are tracing does not mean that German fascism drew its ideas from this source exclusively. Quite the contrary. The so-called philosophy of fascism based itself primarily on racial theory, above all in the form developed by Houston Chamberlain, although in so doing, to be sure, it made some use of vitalism's findings. But for a philosophy with so little foundation or coherence, so profoundly unscientific and coarsely dilettantish to become prevalent, what were needed were a specific philosophical mood, a disintegration of confidence in understanding and reason, the destruction of human faith in progress, incredulity towards irrationalism, myth, and mysticism. And vitalism created just this philosophical mood. Of course, it did not achieve this consciously, and the less so the farther we move away in time from Hitler. It would be absurd to regard Dilthey or Simmel witting forerunners of fascism, not even in the sense in which Nietzsche or Lagarde were its ancestors, do they merit this description. Here, however, we are concerned not with a psychological analysis of intentions, but with the objective dialectics of the development itself. And in the objective sense, every thinker whom we have discussed contributed to the creation of the aforesaid mood in philosophy. 2. Dilthey is founder of imperialist vitalism. Wilhelm Dilthey is next to and after Nietzsche, the most important and influential forerunner of imperialistic vitalism. But whereas Nietzsche achieved the decisive turn to vitalism by focusing his attack on the new agent of historical progress, the proletariat, thereby initiating the open attack on every scientific method very early on, Dilthey was a forerunner, a transitional figure in a much truer sense. His starting point was the positivistic neo-Kantianism of the 60s and 70s. This he wanted gradually to reconstruct into a new philosophy. Subjectively, he always adhered to a scientific standpoint, without overtly breaking with Kantianism, and in particular with the individual sciences. Objectively, to be sure, he proceeded to undermine the scientific method of philosophy in a way that had many repercussions, and in the long run this proved quite as effective as Nietzsche's direct attacks. Dilthey's starting point was psychological and historical. His life work was actually intended to be a critique of historical reason. Kant was to be adapted to contemporary needs, and his philosophy developed in such a way that it would lend itself to laying the foundations of the human sciences, and chiefly history. History, needless to say, in the sense of Ranke or Jakob Burckhardt, not that of the progressive period of bourgeois society. The underlying character traits of the positivistically comprehended Kant agnosticism, phenomenalism, were to be preserved unchanged. In Oyalde, as in all modern Kantians, the master's uncertainties regarding materialism were completely eliminated in the doctrine of the Ding und Sich. But despite Dilthey's Kantian orthodoxy, his philosophy took an important step beyond neo-Kantianism in the direction of vitalistic irrationalism. It promoted not only the upsurge of vitalism proper, but also, in close connection with it, the rebirth of post-Kantian philosophies. At the same time, it ran parallel to the phenomenological school, whose vitalistic advances Dilthey anticipated and influenced more than anybody, and to Bergson and pragmatism in countries outside Germany. Naturally, these tendencies only emerged with absolute clarity in Dilthey, little by little. He stood very close to positivistic neo-Kantianism in his beginnings, even if the seeds of innovation are visible right from the outset. Here we can only provide a brief resume of his most important views. Dilthey's epistemological rationale of vitalism proceeds from the thesis that experiencing the world is the ultimate basis of knowledge. Life itself, liveliness, behind which I cannot penetrate, contains structural connections from which all experiencing and thinking is explained. And this is the decisive factor for the whole possibility of knowing. There is a knowledge of reality only because the full structural coherence which emerges in the forms, principles, and categories of thinking is contained in life and experience, and because this coherence can be shown analytically in life and experience. At first, this sounds like an attempt to argue an objective idealism epistemologically. If all categories are contained in objective reality, and our perception descries them there alone, the subjectivistic narrowness of neo-Kantian idealism, with its inability to provide a proper world image overcome, this impression becomes even stronger if one acquaints oneself more closely with Dilthey's position. Correctly, Dilthey sensed that an epistemological solution to man's relationship with the objective external world could only be elucidated by way of praxis. Supposing we had a man who was all observation and intelligence, then this intellectual apparatus might contain every possible means of projecting images, yet all of it would never succeed in differentiating a subject from concrete objects. The core of the distinction is far rather the relation of impulse and thwarted intention, of will and resistance. If, however, we pursue Dilthey's statements further, we will see that, at every point, he was by no means speaking of objective reality itself. For Dilthey, impulses, etc., are not organs or agencies through which to comprehend and progressively to master intellectually a reality existing independently of consciousness. They merely form the inner side, as it were, of the coherent framework of our observations, ideas, and thought processes. Now, impulse, pressure, and resistance are, it were, the fixed components imparting their solidity to all external objects. Will, struggle, labor, need, and satisfaction are the ever-recurring nuclear elements comprising the framework of intellectual activity. The world portrayed in Dilthey's epistemology is purely determined by the consciousness as that of the neo-Kantians, for all the practical categories he cites are just as much elements of a subjective world, the purely intellectual ones against which he polemicized, and which he strove to surmount. At this period, the attempt to comprehend the objectivity of the real world was seldom conscious and seldom decided, and it proceeded from the vague sensing of a connection between praxis and comprehension of objective reality. The very fate of the attempt shows the correctness of our view that vitalistic epistemology never surpassed, in principle, the subjective idealism of the preceding age. But precisely here it is necessary to show the new and distinguishing aspect of the vitalistic terms of inquiry. Dilthey concluded his train of thought with the words, "Here we have life itself. It is perpetually its own proof." 3. And, he added in another passage, all the problems of transcendence contained in the Kantian thing in itself were thereby automatically solved. From the standpoint of life, no proof can be obtained by proceeding beyond what is contained in consciousness to something transcendent. We are only analyzing that which belief in the external world rests upon in life itself. Life gives the fundamental preconditions of knowledge, and thinking cannot reach behind them. It may test and investigate them from the angle of the extent of their realization in science. But they are hence not hypotheses, but principles or preconditions arising out of life which enter science as the means to which they are tied. Let us suppose the existence of a reason without will or feelings. This intellectual world, which would be a consciousness, might well develop differing degrees of dependence when it appeared, and a regularity therein, which would match the causal idea and the distinct tie-in between ego and objects. But in the last resort, Even the difference of subject and object still attaches to the functions, and so to the activities and image. And the no-ledge value of the antithesis of subject and object is not that of a transcendent fact. The subject and otherness or externality are nothing else than that which is contained and given in the experiences of life itself. This is all reality, for we have the complete epistemological basis of vitalism in undiluted form. As a result of the identification of life and experience, we obtain that equivocation between objectivity and subjectivity, which is the essence of vitalistic pseudo-objectivity. For had Dilthey carried to a rigorous conclusion his original aim at objectivity, he would soon have been obliged to recognize that the resistance met by his impulses, etc., is something broader and more comprehensive, something quite other than merely the objective side of life. Here experience encounters objective reality, and life forms only part of it unless, and this was alien to Dilthey, one hylozoistically views the whole of objective reality as life. But Dilthey's inquiry remained bogged down in a unity of experience and life which he never thought through to a conclusion or really analyzed. He did not acknowledge at all an objective reality independent of consciousness. There is present in this a distant analogy with the problems of classical German philosophy. Here a similar subject-object was sought and professedly located. But in this very instance the differences are far more revealing than the analogies. Firstly, Hegel wittingly and resolutely surpassed the subjectivism of Kantian epistemology, whereas Dilthey arrived at its neo-Kantian, even more decidedly subjectivist sequels. Secondly, the object side of the thinking subject-object embraced the whole of reality in classical German philosophy, whereas Dilthey's subject-object is merely an equating of experience and life, with a marked preponderance of the former. In classical philosophy, therefore, there did arise a type of objectivity, albeit beset with all the problems pertaining to objective idealism, whereas Dilthey's inevitably remains a pseudo-objectivity. And thirdly, the classical philosophical solution permitted of, and indeed demanded, a rational dialectical perception of the world. The transformation of substance into subject was also, with Hegel, a discovery of reason's governance in reality, all-embracing, encompassing all depths. Dilthey's obscure union of life and experience, on the other hand, necessarily posits the essence of reality thus, apprehended as something fundamentally irrational. Dilthey's great discovery is, therefore, that our belief in the reality of the external world springs from the experience of resistance and obstruction forced upon us by our will-controlled relations to persons and things in the external world. This is a vitalistic revival of the Kantian affection of the subject through the thing in itself. But vitalism robbed it of its original materialist flavor. Dilthey set forth his views as follows. The thing and its conceptual formula, the substance, is not a creation of the understanding, but one of the totality of our spiritual powers. Thus, the external world is not independent of human consciousness, but its producer is not understanding or reason, but the totality of the human mind, vitalistically grasped. This apparent extension of the basic epistemological questions would, in Dilthey's view, bring about an insolubly paradoxical concept of that which transcends consciousness if intellectually treated. But he continued, the basis of these categories lies in the experiences of our will and of the associated emotions. All sensations and thought processes clothe, as it were, this naked experience. In proportion to the accumulation of experiences, that character of reality will grow which images have for us. It will become a power completely encircling us. Here is life itself. It is perpetually its own proof. We have quoted Dilthey in rather more detail so as to make it clear how little, despite his discovery and his new terminology, he advanced beyond the agnosticist solipsistic character of neo-Kantianism on the central epistemological question. But like all modern idealists, he protested against the conclusions rightly drawn from his epistemology, against the interpretation of his position as a subjective idealism and agnosticism. The further he moved in concrete statements from the original problem, the more vigorously he acted as though he acknowledged an external world independent of the consciousness. Thus he once stated that the laws of the natural sciences and their presuppositions of facts confounded all skepticism. They do clearly show us that there is an objective order behind appearances, independent of us and with its own laws. This is the expression of a great reality existing independently of us. To be sure, he at once added, it is certain that we never perceive reality itself, only symbols, signs, and so forth. This vitalistic twist to the basic Kantian epistemological question necessarily brought psychology to the center of philosophical interest. This again is a general trait of the positivist renewal of Kant and of Dilthey's initial tendencies. But here, as Dilthey developed his own particular views then, arose something qualitatively new, a program for a special type of psychology. It amounted to an antithesis between the previous explanatory psychology and a descriptive or understanding psychology. This new science was intended to lay the basis for all human sciences, principally history. The history of the rise of vitalism in general takes concrete shape around this problem. A certain relative justification for the proposition itself existed in the critique of positivism's prejudices and limits, for the positivists thought it possible to reveal the course of history and, even more, its coherence, with the aid of some abstract psychological categories. But the vitalists' dissatisfaction was not applied to studying the true causes of the historical framework and of society's economic structure and its vicissitudes. Hence the false answer, the need for a new qualitatively total and vital psychology. The answer was false because, in respect of the course of history, the new psychology was just as abstract, just as secondary as the old had been. Since the objective basis of history is broader, wider, and deeper than any individual consciousness, a fact which Dilthey himself, as we shall see, was obliged to recognize in other contexts, all psychology is perforce abstract as a fundamental method of history and bypasses the cardinal problems. There can be no psychology that lays the foundations for the study of history, since the psychology of human beings, acting in history, can only be grasped from the material basis of their lives and deeds, and above all from their work and its objective conditions. Here too, naturally, there are complicated reciprocal influences, but the material basis remains the primary factor, that which is decisive in the last resort. Thus, Dilthey's attempt to reconstruct psychology as to make it a basis for the human sciences turned its relationship to objective, socio-historical reality on its head, just as much as it reversed that of the positivism he was challenging. All that Dilthey did was to replace the false abstraction of that which is governed by mere understanding with an irrational, putative totality of experienced life. The only difference, and this only exactly expresses the transition to the new age of vitalism, was that the positivist psychology represented a shallow, mechanical rationalism, whereas Dilthey, while divining a real dialectic question, posed and answered it irrationalistically from the outset, thus causing its dialectic character to disappear. The chief lack that Dilthey found in the old explanatory psychology was an ability to solve the problem of the spiritual world's relationship to the physical. It contained a tangle of equally unprovable hypotheses blocking the path to reality. Here again, he was relatively justified in his dissatisfaction with a psychology which would not concede that spiritual phenomena depended in a materialistic sense on material physical ones, but shied away from an openly idealistic answer. The vitalistic solution, however, consisted merely in an irrational sweeping aside of the real problem. Life was to have the unity of body and soul as its content. But since we already know life actually meant experience to Dilthey, he clothed a radically subjectively rooted answer in quasi-objective terminology and eliminated the dualism of body and soul, with the result that all the objects of psychological study appeared projected on the level of experienced life. A simple description of the psychic facts was to succeed the old hypotheses. This meant the relegation to a subsidiary role of all causal and ordered knowledge in this field, and the creation of more scope for irrationalism. Dilthey's proposition had as its purpose a new methodological foundation for the historical sciences. Now in positivism, these were degenerating to the extent that the actual reality of history was receding more and more in the face of academic controversies with scholars concerning the phenomena of history, literature and art, philosophy, and so on. Dilthey's opposition to this Alexandrianism, the turning to the matter itself, which he had already demonstrated in his praxis, and which he now formulated in theoretical methodological terms, is understandable, and it subsequently became of great influence. Hence Dilthey became the founder of the humanistic method. But whilst fully recognizing the relative rights of its critique of academic positivism, we must also stress at this point that the matter itself, to which Dilthey and the phenomenologists gave central importance, is simply not the matter itself in its totality and objectivity. It is not total, for actual social connections and conditions disappear behind the uniqueness of isolated objects, and where these are linked together, this happens with the aid of mythicized abstractions and analogies. It is not objective, for experience as the organon of knowledge creates an atmosphere of subjective arbitrariness in selection, emphasis, designation, etc. With Dilthey there was still a certain tendency towards objectivity, but in Gundolf, subjective arbitrariness, as a consciously applied method, clearly comes to the forefront. Granted, with Dilthey, as somewhat later with the neo-Kantians Windelband and Rickert, this struggle by descriptive psychology against law and causality relates only to the social sciences. In these, objects appear from within, as reality and a living structure originaliter, whereas the natural sciences have as their object facts which enter the consciousness from without, as phenomena and separate data. Therefore, nature is something we explain, the spiritual life something we understand. Here we should note an inconsistency in this recognition of the ordered objectivity of nature from the angle of Dilthey's epistemology. If mythicized life replaces the Kantian thing in itself, there is no reason why nature should form an exception. This very point shows us how instinctively Dilthey identified life and experience. For considered from the angle of experience, the bipartition is a logical one, albeit also a purely subjectivist one. Thus it is no coincidence that later developments corrected Dilthey's illogicality to the extent of including nature too in the subjective irrationalistic equation of life and experience. And so irrationalism came to occupy the center of Dilthey's philosophy, at least as far as it dealt with the social sciences, and these virtually encompass his entire oeuvre. He defined the essence of the understanding process as follows. Hence there is an irrational element in all understanding, just as life itself is irrational. It cannot be represented by formulae arrived at by logical processes. And an ultimate, though completely subjective certainty that lies in this re-experiencing can find no substitute in an examination of the knowledge value of the chains of reasoning by which the process of understanding may be represented. The very nature of understanding imposes these limits on its logical treatment. And Dilthey summed it up more astringently still in the course of his later statements. Life cannot be brought before the judgment seat of reason. The inevitable result of this is an aristocratic epistemology. Here again Dilthey proceeded consistently to the last. He said of the hermeneutics, the systematic application of understanding, that they are, however, conjectural and never produce demonstrative certainty. And in other places he stressed that interpretation, as the artistically governed reproductive understanding, must always involve a touch of genius. Thus in Dilthey's view, the new psychology is by definition the privilege, the secret doctrine of a specific aesthetic historicist spiritual aristocracy. Seen from the angle of Dilthey's propositions, which, as we have noted, express a deep-seated ideological need among the bourgeois intelligentsia of the imperialist age, this methodologically central position of intuition is an inevitable consequence. Hopeless situations call for desperate remedies. And as always in the history of philosophy, when a remedy is sought, and it is believed, found in a saltum mortale, the real epistemological and methodological preconditions of the solution escaped examination. Its adherents overlooked the crassest methodological quid pro quo, because the need for a solution was so strong that it obscured all possible doubts. The new objectivity presupposed a new organ of knowledge. It was a central issue of imperialist philosophy to place this new mode of knowledge, this new organ, intuition, in opposition to conceptual rational thought. In reality, the fact is that intuition constitutes a psychological element of every scientific working method. Superficial study can evoke the immediate impression that intuition is more concrete and synthetic than abstract discursive thinking and concepts. Certainly, this is only an impression, for psychologically, intuition signifies nothing else than the sudden conscious realization of a thought process that has hitherto gone on partly unconsciously. Objectively, therefore, it is never separable from the largely conscious working process. And for conscientious scientific thinking, it is a serious task, firstly, to check whether these intuitively obtained results stand up scientifically, and secondly, organically to build them into the rational conceptual system so that it will afterwards be quite impossible to tell what was discovered by the power of deduction and what was discovered with the aid of intuition. Thus, considered in its proper place, as a psychological element of the working process, intuition is a supplement to conceptual thought and not its antithesis. And the intuitive discovery of a correlation can never become a criterion of truth. A superficial psychological study of scientific investigation will foster the illusion that intuition is an organ independent of abstract thought for the comprehension of higher correlations. This illusion, a confusing of subjective investigation with the objective scientific method, became, with the support of the general subjectivism of imperialistic philosophy, the bedrock of the modern theory of intuition. The relationship between the resulting process and dialectic knowledge further heightened the illusion. From a subjectivist perspective, it was tempting to assume that the dialectic contradiction came about through a conceptual process, whereas its resolving synthesis, its assimilation into a higher unity, was the product of intuition. This is naturally an illusion, for true dialectics express every synthesis conceptually once more, and do not recognize any synthesis a definitive answer. Precisely because it is an accurate reflection of the objects of the real world, genuine scientific dialectic thinking always contains the conceptual association and analysis of ideas. For that reason, intuition is not an organ of knowledge, not an element of the scientific method. As we have seen, Hegel clearly expounded all this in answer to Schelling in the introduction to his phenomenology. In the philosophy of the imperialist period, on the other hand, intuition occupied a central position in the objective theory of method. This need emerged directly because thinkers were turning away from the epistemological formalism of the preceding period. This they had to do, for the quest for a Weltanschauung already signifies in itself a substantial proposition. Subjective idealism's epistemology, however, was of necessity a purely formal and not a dialectic analysis, not an ideational formulating of the conceptual content. If thought aspires beyond such limits, if it seeks to perceive real contents philosophically, then it must have a twofold support. It must find support in, on the one hand, the reflection theory of materialism, and on the other, the dialectically grasped universal order, which is to say an order which is not to be taken as merely a static framework of objectivities and structures, but as the dynamic framework of evolution and of rational history as well. Intuition helped imperialist philosophy to turn away from the formalism of epistemology and also from subjective idealism and agnosticism, without in the least disturbing their foundations. So this philosophy will always put forward the claim that the content to which it aspires, the philosophical reality which it seeks to attain, is to be appreciated as a qualitatively different, higher reality than the conceivable world. And in this context, the subjectively interpreted fact of intuition will give the impression of being the sign of a flash of inspiration in comprehending this higher world. It now became crucial for the new philosophy to refute at all costs the criticism coming from the side of conceptual analysis. This protective action by intuition appeared in similar old philosophies, where it already took the line of an aristocratic epistemology. It was based on the standpoint that it was not given to everybody to grasp the higher reality intuitively. Thus, anybody who sought conceptual criteria for intuitive perception was merely proving that he lacked all capacity for the intuitive grasping of the higher reality. And thus his criticism merely revealed his own lower nature, just as those people who failed to see the fine new clothes on Hans Andersen's naked emperor were unqualified or intolerably stupid. Such an epistemology of intuition was also needed for the reason that, by virtue of its very nature, all reality thus comprehended is arbitrary and cannot be checked. As the organ of higher knowledge, intuition, at the same time, provided a justification for this arbitrariness. This proclamation of the irrationalism of life's ordered framework, which, formally speaking, found a coolly sober expression in Dilthey himself, and of conjectural intuition as its organ of knowledge, formed the basis of the great influence which Dilthey exercised even before the war. Let us refer only to the chiefly literary, historical, and aesthetic activities of the George school. For its spiritual leader, Gundolf, the division of explaining and understanding was no longer sufficient. Even within the realm of experience, he drew a distinction between primal experience and educated experience, whereby the anti-historical, anti-social character of the doctrine of intuition found a far firmer expression than in Dilthey, or even in Simmel. For if we examine more closely the content and methodology of Gundolf's distinction, we see that the criterion of actual, unfalsified experience, of the primal experience, consists in the very fact of its being torn out of the context of its social surroundings, surroundings comprehensible through understanding and reason. Its direct content outleaps its defined limits. Its philosophical substance has become purely irrationalistic. By primal experience, wrote Gundolf, I understand, for instance, the religious, titanic, or erotic by Goethe's educational experiences. I understand his experience of the German heritage, of Shakespeare, classical antiquity, Italy, the Orient, even his experience of German society. Dilthey, to be sure, was not an irrationalist of post-war proportions. This is already manifest in the fact that he confined his method to the social sciences. But here, too, irrationalism, although it was the logical conclusion of his method, was a consequence which he constantly endeavored to surmount and to direct back on to the path of a quasi-scientific method. For Dilthey did not believe in an irreconcilable antithesis between reason and life, science and intuition. He thought rather that it was possible to evolve the full splendor of the subjective and objective world out of experience, to proceed from experience via its understanding and the systematization of this understanding in the method, interpretation of hermeneutics, to a higher and more comprehensive concept of the scientific method. Dilthey, who all in all was a man of exceptional knowledge and genuine learning, himself frequently noticed that his two basic tendencies were mutually contradictory, and he overtly stated the resulting antinomies. But again and again he attempted, vainly, to overcome them. Our exposition so far shows us already that these antinomies were irrevocable because of his starting point and because of his method. Dilthey himself said of the circle inherent in the vitalistic argumentation of the science of history, "History is intended to teach what life is, and it must find its resources in life." So vicious circle existed at the very outset of the method, and the false circle was none other than that of pseudo-objectivity. It had its basis in Dilthey's idea of the identical subject-object, life equals experience. With a truly objective method, it is clear that the categories, at least in their being in itself, are contained in objective reality and only read off by the perceiving subject. Thus Dilthey's dilemma contains the ambiguous basic character, the epistemological dichotomy of his philosophical starting point. But still more important, because more concrete and substantial, was die impossibility of locating in experience a path to laying the foundations of the historical sciences. Dilthey, certainly, labored under the illusion that all categories of objective reality are contained in experience, and that it only requires the correct method in order to develop them. He overlooked the fact that experience epistemologically presupposes these categories as forms of objective reality. They determine experience, but experience does not determine them. And we are setting aside the fact that this starting point dictates a basically uncritical attitude in the first place to the experiences on which the method is founded. The Diltheyan method does not, however, take into account the whole historically decisive complex that the consciousness of man acting in history does not by any means necessarily provide the key to an adequate causation of the historical connections. This problem Hegel had already raised, and Marxism solved it with the theory of false consciousness. Dilthey's historical knowledge, his own theory of historical method, confronted him, albeit inadequately and incompletely, with that which he failed to perceive epistemologically. Even with Dilthey, the dissolving of all historical phenomena into experiences, i.e., into subjective facts of consciousness, was bounded by the objective spirit, which he himself regarded as the central category of history. For his own part, he saw the difficulty, the antinomy, perfectly, clearly. Thus he said of the problem of the objective spirit, "There now arises the question as to how a correlation which is not produced as such in somebody's mind, and which, therefore, is neither experienced directly or indirectly, nor traceable to a person's experience, from his expressions and statements about them, form itself as such in the historian? This presupposes the possibility of forming logical subjects which are not psychological. It is soul we are looking for. But by what route can we discover soul when no individual soul is involved?" Thus Dilthey saw the difficulty very clearly, while failing to recognize its epistemological roots. And hence he failed to see that in order to solve it, he would have had to renounce his whole new science of psychology and foundation of history. There is the further point that Dilthey's two viewpoints of modern relativism, the psychological, anthropological, and the historical, likewise formed an antinomy, an insoluble contradiction. By virtue of its very nature, Dilthey's psychological, anthropological argumentation of the social sciences tended to accept the basic facts that it had discovered as constant and superhistorical. For it appears to be quite clear that man, ever since he became man, was subject to changes no longer cardinal from an anthropological standpoint. Those changes which we ascertain in men's thoughts, emotional life, etc., are of a socio-historical character. For an objective historical theory, such as historical materialism, the result is no kind of antinomy, but simply the mutual dialectical complementing of both viewpoints. It may even render the most rewardingly anthropological viewpoints of service to historical knowledge, and vice versa. In Dilthey's theory of experience, however, the 2 points of view inevitably polarized in an antinomy. From the anthropological viewpoint, the result was the superhistorical character of man, while from the historical viewpoint it was a boundless relativism which admitted of nothing thoroughgoing. And for Dilthey there was no way out of this antinomy. He could not plump for one viewpoint and discard the other. He needed them both, partly out of the historian's understandable feeling that both principles are inextricably caught up in reality itself, and partly because of imperialism's philosophical needs, to which both anthropological superhistoricity and historical relativism were equally essential. So he perceived the antinomy and remained stuck with it. This standpoint was not only Dilthey's, it is found in nearly all the historians working during the imperialistic period. Thus racial theory, at this time, was always based on an imagined permanence of the life of the race, which might become degenerate but was fundamentally incapable of developing into something qualitatively different. Dilthey, coming up against this problem time and again, gave the most diverse, contradictory answers to it. Thus he said, on the one hand, human nature is always the same. 13. In analyzing, on the other hand, the natural system of the 17th-18th century, i.e., in polemics against the Enlightenment view of history, he said, "The human type melts away in the process of history." 14. And he knew also that he could not answer the question. He said that for us, the question as to whether men of different periods may be regarded as the same within certain limits in respect of strength of motives cannot be answered at all at present. 1.5. This made the whole psychological anthropological rationale of the social sciences of problematical value. But since the interpretation of all historical and social phenomena from the angle of experience formed the core of Dilthey's philosophy, his whole basic conception was thereby rendered illusory. Dilthey succeeded only in compromising and pulling apart the causal psychology of positivism, for which he substituted an essentially non-causal, indeed anti-causal morphology of spiritual phenomena, which became of decisive moment for vitalistic relativism in all later developments. Although descriptive psychology and its intuitive method were, as we have noted, uncommonly hazy and contradictory, these very qualities ensured their long-lasting effect. There arose a morphological bias, whereby the original meaning of morphology increasingly faded away, and where morphology was more of a colorful catchword than a clearly defined method. Imperialism's general philosophical needs, products of an increasing intensity in both the external and inner conflicts, were driving philosophy further and further beyond the abstract and insubstantial formalism of the strict Neo-Kantians and urging it towards a concrete, substantial treatment of the problems at issue. But since they did not, in the class, and hence methodological context, allow philosophy to tackle the concrete problems of content with a concrete method, precisely such an equivocal method as the one we have indicated above was the fittest expression for the regressive demands of the day. From the same historical source as Dilthey's descriptive psychology, there sprang, parallel to but independent of it, Husserl's phenomenology, with which it had many affinities. Dilthey immediately welcomed the latter as epoch-making. 1-6 For his own part, Husserl at first confined himself to the descriptive treatment of purely formal logical problems. But under Dilthey's influence, Husserl's most influential pupils went outside this group of problems, as we shall show in detail later. Like oil, they were to strive for a universal philosophical method based on the descriptive approach. Dilthey's whole thinking was determined by the need for a concrete and substantial philosophy capable of exerting on current affairs an influence similar to that enjoyed by philosophy in its great bygone eras. On the other hand, Dilthey detected that the old philosophies in their original form could not possibly play this role in the present. Although his concerns with the history of philosophy, in association with a general cultural history, outwardly formed the greater part of his, they were not for him an end in itself. Just as he intended the development of experience into understanding and hermeneutics to culminate in a worldview, so he intended his historical treatment of the problems of philosophy to be only prelude to the presentation of a modern worldview. Dilthey's historical innovations were important and influential. Along with Nietzsche and Eduard von Hartmann, he was among the first to inaugurate the campaign against great rationalistic philosophy since Descartes, with its natural scientific bias. With his Schleiermacher biography and works on Novalis, Hölderlin, etc., he was one of the initiators of the Romantic Renaissance in the imperial period. His discovery and annotation of the young Hegel's manuscripts became crucial to the vitalistic interpretation of Hegelian philosophy in the post-war period. His Goethe study likewise ushered in the vitalistic interpretation of Goethe, subsequently leading from Simmel and Gundolf to Klages, and so on. Thus, we see that the initiative was considerable and of historical significance. The philosophical results, however, remained exceedingly meager. Here, we shall consider Dilthey's researches in the history of literature and philosophy only insofar as they serve the argument of his vitalistic world outlook. In this respect, they had the function of proving that metaphysics were impossible in principle, and that the medieval theological system, the scientific natural system of the 17th-18th century, and the attempt by Kant's major success source to revive metaphysics in a new way, were all therefore necessarily doomed to failure. Here, however, the profound contradictions in intuitionism appear once again. Dilthey wrote, "Philosophies are not products of thinking. They do not arise out of the mere volition of knowing. The comprehension of reality is an important element in their shaping, but only one among others." 17. This was a genuine question concerned with the broader and not narrowly philosophical basis of the origins of worldviews in man's social being, and Dilthey, in facing it, endeavored to exceed the limits of positivism. But as always happens in the history of irrationalism, he at once twisted the question into a false subjectivism by transforming into the subjective, into an antithesis of intuition and reason, the objective contradictions resulting from the dialectics of being and consciousness. Dilthey stated, "Every genuine philosophy is an intuition springing from the state of being within life." 18. Once again, he was turning rich, real, objective historical life into a mere subjective experience. At the same time, the scientific-ness of the worldview, the methodological value of its scientific argument ceased to exist. Thus, in Diltheyan philosophy, the scientific method was limited to leading up to the threshold of the worldview, at which point it was revoked. Hence, Dilthey, partly against his own intentions, became a founder of irrationalistic arbitrariness in questions of worldview or outlook. Dilthey's own solution had its basis in his relativism, in which respect it was also most successful. It is clear from what we have expounded so far that Dilthey could not possibly come down on the side of an outlook with a clearly outlined content and method.
His efforts led only to the achievement of a psychological and historical typology of philosophical outlooks. This marked the onset of a development which, as we shall see, was to govern the philosophy of the whole imperialistic period, typology as the expression of historical relativism. The impossibility of discovering real historical connections from these hypotheses, the increasing denial of a set of principles behind history and, in particular, of an ascertainable progress within it, inspired in Dilthey the idea of giving expression to historical, spiritual connections by setting forth a typology of the standpoints which might be adopted. First of all, this was an assertion of pure relativism. Typology afforded the possibility of a concealed abstention from judgment which posited different, and often opposing standpoints as being of equal value. Meanwhile, imperialism's needs for a philosophical outlook were fast advancing beyond this typological stage. On the one hand, the critical abstention formally expressed in typology became increasingly formal, that is, a standpoint was adopted de facto, chiefly in opposition to materialism but mostly, to be sure, without renouncing the relativistic advantages which typology provided. On the other hand, the anthropological foundation of the types very quickly condensed into a myth-like substantiality, into a figure. The typological figures were seen as the leading actors in the drama of history. To a large extent this was already the case with Nietzsche, who occupied an advanced position in the rise of the irrationalistic myths and was, therefore, regarded for a long time as unscientific. Not before Spengler did the overtly myth-creating function of typology strongly resume operations, which reached their height in the types of fascist anthropology. It is easy to see that here the dilemma between anthropology and history which we have analyzed, and which idealism could not resolve, was returning in a more concrete form. In the course of irrationalism's development it determined a de facto anti-historicity, the creation of a mythicized pseudo-history. Now with regard to his philosophical typology, Dilthey discovered in history three major basic types: naturalism, the idealistic freedom doctrine, and objective idealism. Psychologically, he traced these three types back to understanding, volition and feeling respectively. In his methodological and historical discussions, he revealed the inevitable narrowness and one-sidedness of each type. 19. He believed, however, that these confines resulted from the hitherto dominant practicing of philosophy along the lines of understanding. The contradictions come about, therefore, through the independent status that objective world images acquire in the scientific consciousness. It is this acquisition of independence which turns a system into metaphysics. And Dilthey was under the illusion that the contradictions could be removed if this tendency towards systematic extension, towards metaphysics were blocked. For he opined the following: in the sphere of objective interpreting, each of these outlooks contains a combination of world knowledge, life appreciation and principles of action. Here too Dilthey was starting out from a question which is in fact raised by life. That mental reflections of reality, intellectual syntheses of its elements were undertaken from different viewpoints in the course of history, is a fact of the history of philosophy. Another fact which merits examination is that, under specific historical conditions, different viewpoints may be of assistance in comprehending important sides of objective reality. But here Dilthey was guilty of distortion, just as he had already distorted, in a subjectivistic and intuitionistic way, that side of the origin of the world outlook transcending philosophy in the narrower sense. For all the questions in this complex may only be posed and answered correctly if one proceeds from the objective structure of society, the lines along which it develops and the concrete class struggles within it. The neo-Kantian history of philosophy ignored all such lines of inquiry. Dilthey's need for a world outlook impelled him in this direction. The importance which he attached to the question, as well as his immediate subjective idealistic distortion of it, indicates how strongly the imperialist period's need for a world outlook demanded that historical materialism be constantly polemicized against, instead of ignored, and that such polemics should claim to answer in a deeper way the questions it raised. In Dilthey himself, this was still manifested in a more or less spontaneous, unconscious form. He wishes to oppose the general materialistic view of history with something philosophically higher. In Esimil's case the polemics appear to be quite conscious, and they became increasingly strong up to Mannheim and Freire. And as they did so, that antinomy between an anthropological and a historical viewpoint which we have already stressed also came into its own. Dilthey, in this topology, wished to raise himself above the historical and to locate in the anthropological principle a basis for his topology, and in particular for his type's philosophical synthesis. This attempt was doomed soon as he set up the topology, because major historical phenomena can never be adduced from such threadbare psychological anthropological principles, and certainly not from artificially isolated spiritual faculties like understanding, volition or feeling. A scientifically practicable topology could only be discerned from history itself by abstracting out of it, out of the historically conditioned standpoints which men may adopt to objective reality, the pervasive elements in this process. But then the deciding factors would no longer be anthropological psychological attributes, but the essential types of philosophical positions. Dilthey had an occasional inkling of this. He wrote, the great homomorphic relations existing between individuation and circumstances must be developed theoretically. Single quote 21 His methodology, however, had no organ through which to comprehend such interacting influences since it was devised precisely in order to circumvent such questions, to conceal them in irrationalistic obscurity. An even more evident point is the failure of Dilthey's attempt to surpass anthropological relativism through a synthesis of types. In tracing back the psychologically rooted types to understanding, emotion and volition, Dilthey dreamed of a harmony of philosophical types similar to the harmony which these psychical forces may achieve in a human being. But all this remained a dream, objectively not least, because the lack of harmony troubling Dilthey by no means stemmed primarily from psychological or anthropological causes. Since it was a consequence of the social division of labor within capitalism, it could never, within the frame of capitalism's continued existence, be superseded psychologically or philosophically. Here we are dealing with the subjective idealistic distortion of a problem arising out of life, and not for the first time in Dilthey. And here the mystification he accomplished did in fact weigh heavily on his conscience. For in rendering this question concrete, Dilthey did not in reality advance from his topology to a philosophical synthesis, but destroyed the abstract anthropological foundations of his own topology. Himself conceded that every real philosophy must spring from the unity of understanding, volition and emotion. Now from this position, Dilthey had either to regard the earlier philosophers as monsters fossilized in partiality, or else to discard his whole topology. And not even the rejection of it, according to his hypotheses, could point the way to a world outlook with philosophical scientific foundations. Of course he did not resort to either of these extremes. But that he often sensed the insoluble nature of the question, and hence the fragility and hollowness of the basis of his own philosophy, is distinctly visible. The presentation of such a world outlook is confined in Dilthey sto obscurant nations. For once understanding, volition and emotion have been hypostasized into autonomous, historically operative entities matched by their own sharply contrasting, mutually exclusive philosophical types. They cannot be converted back into purely psychical factors without pulling down the whole structure. In particular, one cannot annul the autonomous existence of the philosophical tendencies in order to achieve the imagined harmony. Scientifically speaking, Dilthey as a historian of philosophy could substantiate only a complete relativism. An unceasing battle of rival philosophies in which a specific selection is made, but there is no single choice. Its my or types stand beside one another, autonomous, unprovable and indestructible. Indeed, Dilthey now and then came to refute in principle the possibility of the imagined synthesis. It is denied to us to behold these facets together. The pure light of truth we can glimpse only via an irregularly broken ray. So Dilthey sounded a final note of resignation and despair. At the end of his life he said quite candidly that sometimes he deeply envied such personalities as Rousseau or Carlyle who dared to express their convictions publicly, deterred by no scientific scruples. And this dilemma of science and philosophy in the broader sense was again highly characteristic in respect of the bankruptcy of Dilthey's philosophical endeavors. Neo-Kantianism had, because of this dilemma, dismissed every question of world outlook from its philosophy. The later Vitalism rejected science and scientific philosophy in the name of irrationalism. Dilthey was a transitional figure between these extremes of pre-imperialistic bourgeois philosophy. Not for nothing did he add, when recalling his friend Graf Georg von Wartenberg, is not my own historical viewpoint a barren skepticism, measured by such a life as his. Nonetheless, even here he declared his allegiance to a scientifically based standpoint, one useless to his search for a Weltanschauung. Then I became determined not to seek even happiness through a belief which did not stand up to thought. Single quote 24 In this respect, therefore, Dilthey differed very sharply from the thinkers who later carried on and extended the drift of his argument. Even with Dilthey, to be sure, the resignation was not devoid of illusions. The knife of historical relativism which has dissected all metaphysics and religion must also provide the remedy. We must be thorough. We must make philosophy itself the object of philosophy. Single quote 25 This was an illusion not only methodologically, but also in respect of historical reality. Further advances along the lines he had pursued were to produce no outlook with a new, scientific basis such as he had envisaged. On the one hand, his great influence, as broad as it was profound, extended both psychological and historical relativism, bringing them closer to nihilistic skepticism. And on the other, by way of the increasingly extreme intuitionistic and irrationalistic movements, it set philosophy on the track of disordered fantasy and arbitrary myth-making. Later developments removed from his work all his attempts at a scientific argumentation and cast them aside. His suggestions were only exploited in order to oppose the scientific spirit, in order to combat it. That this, even if it ran counter to Dilthey's subjective intentions, was objectively possible both accounts for his influence and stamps it a reactionary one. As regards his contents and the methodology to which he aspired, Dilthey had precious little to do with fascism. Yet objectively speaking, these by no means fortuitous repercussions of his work made him a pioneer, albeit unwittingly and only indirectly, of the subsequent open struggle against reason, the eclipse of philosophical awareness in Germany. 3. Vitalism in the pre-war period. In his whole mentality and education Dilthey was a man of the pre-imperialistic period, but he sensed the new problems very strongly in advance and subsequently passed into this problem complex. In Simmel, his junior by 25 years, the intellectual tendencies of pre-war imperialism were concentrated in an incomparably more salient and immediate way. He was truly the child and representative of the new period. As in Dilthey's case, to be sure, Kant and positivism formed his philosophical starting point. But with Simmel we are dealing with the positivism of a more advanced age, and no longer with Comte, Taine or Backel. Influenced very strongly by Nietzsche, Simmel attains eminence in the struggle against the philosophical and social consequences of historical materialism. From the outset, his thought spontaneously ran parallel to Anglo-American pragmatism and developed a close affinity with Bergsonian tendencies. His Kantianism too had a different, more imperialistic nuance. He was resolutely subjectivistic, and the objective reality of the external world was already, for him, no longer a problem at all. On the contrary, the chief bias of his epistemology was an energetic battle against every kind of imitation, every kind of mental reproduction of reality it really is. Thus he said of historical knowledge that it was no mere reproduction, but an intellectual activity which fashions out of its material something that, in itself, it does not yet constitute. 26 With Simmel we see perfectly clearly how the right-wing critique of the narrowly mechanical theory of imitation, given an idealistic basis and a dominance of formal logic, necessarily led to vitalistic subjectivism. Simmel, like many modern idealists, saw that the old materialism's mechanical theory of imitation was unable to solve complicated problems of concreteness in a satisfactory form. And as with many modern idealists, this observation caused him to reject the knowability, indeed the existence of objective reality. But Simmel was far more decided in this rejection than most of his predecessors or contemporaries. This followed from his vitalistic stance, which allowed him radically to deny any objective reality independent of the subject and yet to confront man with a pseudo-objective external world, because life here offered itself to him as a real intermediary. Life appears to be the most extreme objectivity to which we may penetrate directly as animated subjects, the farthest and most permanent objectifying of the subject. With life we occupy a position halfway between the ego and the idea, subject and object, person and cosmos. Single quote 27. Accordingly, he dismissed the epistemological question in its only correct and clear formulation, namely the priority of being or consciousness, in the name of a vitalistic third road. The question was to be modified as follows: does consciousness depend on life, or does life depend on consciousness? For after all, life is the being which stands between consciousness and being in general. Life is a higher concept and higher actuality beyond consciousness. This is life at all events. 28. Epistemologically speaking, real life belongs to being and experience to consciousness. But with the explanation of life as a third concept contrasted with being and consciousness, that irrationalistic pseudo-objective intermediate realm is created which not only permits but demands an unlimited preponderance of subjectivity. Thus the structure of Simmel's world picture came into being. Simmel no longer acknowledged any actual object world, but only various forms of the vitalistic attitude to reality, each of which produced its own world of objects. The coming into effect of certain fundamental spiritual forces and impulses means that they create an object for themselves. The meaning of the object of this function of love, art or religious feeling is only the meaning of the functions themselves. Each of these enlists its object for its own world by thereby creating it as its own. Hence it does not make the slightest difference whether the contents assembled in this particular form already exist in other forms or not. Single quote 29. This epistemological standpoint shows a striking congruence with that aesthetic reasoning employed to surmount naturalism in pre-war imperialism. Simmel's epistemology generally was very strongly oriented towards the aesthetics of his time. The consequence of this position was a relativism still more radical than Dilthey's had been. Accounts of Simmel's philosophy frequently state that his path led from positivism to metaphysics, that is, to a surmounting of relativism. This view is mistaken. Simmel did develop in the sense that the vitalistic tendencies which had always been dormant in him shifted more and more consciously to the center of his thinking. This, however, meant an increase and not a decrease in relativism. And it is characteristic of vitalism, as the chief philosophical bias in the imperialist era, that the central content of the relativistic thought process was always a depreciation of the scientific method, a creating of space for faith, and a subjective religious feeling without a definite object. Using just this relativistic skepticism as a weapon, let us quote a longer passage from one of Simmel's last works. It illustrates how markedly the extremely relativistic bias was manifested precisely in his late phase. Despite the stress on the ever-advancing and immeasurable progress of our knowledge, it should not be overlooked that at the other end, so to speak, much that we formerly possessed as sure knowledge is sinking into doubt and recognized error. How much medieval man knew, and the enlightened thinker of the 18th century or the materialistic scientific researcher of the 19th, which for us is either completely obsolete or at least completely dubious. How much of that which is now undoubted knowledge will suffer the same fate sooner or later. The effect of man's whole spiritual and practical disposition is that grano salis, and speaking of the broad basis he apprehends only that which matches his convictions, and simply overlooks the counter-examples however startling, a fact totally inexplicable to later eras. Proofs no less factual and convincing were adduced for astrology and miracle cures, for witchcraft and the direct efficacy of prayer as are now adduced for the validity of universal laws of nature. And I by no means exclude the possibility that later centuries or millennia, perceiving as the core and essence of each individual phenomenon its indissoluble, unified individuality, not ascribable to universal laws, will declare such generalities to be as much of a superstition as the aforesaid articles of faith. Once we have abandoned the idea of the absolutely true, which is likewise only a historical construction, we might arrive at the paradoxical idea that in the calmness process of perception, the standard of the truths newly adopted differs only in degree from the standard of the errors we have abolished. That, as in a never-halting procession, just as many true perceptions mount the front steps as illusions are cast down the back steps. 30. We have quoted Simmel's statements at such length in order to show quite plainly the partisan nature of vitalistic relativism. What we are dealing with is not an extreme skepticism, which may, in given circumstances, in a reactionary culture's drift towards dissolution, have progressive functions. Modern relativistic skepticism was directly undermining objective scientific knowledge and, no matter whether its begetters intended this or not, providing scope for the wildest reactionary obscurantism, for the nihilistic mysticism of imperialistic decadence. And this development made such rapid strides that for today's reader there is something comical about Simmel's view that the universal laws of nature would seem a superstition centuries or millennia later. For as we know, it was in the year of Simmel's death that Spengler published the book in which Vitalism undertook to realize this viewpoint. This destructive relativism was imperialistic philosophy's self-defense against dialectical materialism. With Spengler this tendency emerged clearly and overtly, but it was already present in Simmel. The problem of faith, religiosity and religion had already occupied much of Dilthey's attention. And even Dilthey saw in religion an eternal type of human attitude towards reality. But he also sensed that the historical religions, the ideas of God handed down through history, had lost their significance for contemporary man. Simmel adhered more resolutely than Dilthey to the viewpoint that the historical religions and old types of metaphysics had fallen apart. But for him, Schleiermacher's turning inwards was not radical enough. He wanted to obtain for religion and metaphysics a self-governing autocracy of the kind for which the art for art's sake movement was striving in art. Thus he wrote of metaphysics, they present a world picture in accordance with categories which have nothing to do with the categories of empirical cognition. The metaphysical interpretation of the world lies beyond truth and error, which are decisive to a realistically exact one. Single quote 31 Some men's various kinds of attitudes stand beside one another in self-sufficiency and create autonomous worlds which contradict one another no more than, in the sense of an art for art's sake aesthetic, the dramatic treatment of an event contradicts its epic treatment. The religious life, wrote Simmel, creates the world afresh. It signifies the whole of existence set in a particular key, so that in its pure idea it cannot clash with the world picture constructed according to other categories or contradict it in the least. 32. This view of religion was not only the most rigorous application of Simmel's epistemology in this field, but sprang at the same time from his view of the religious situation in his day. Simmel saw that contemporary man had set himself free from the established religions, but that needs hitherto satisfied through a religious fulfillment still survived and sought to assert themselves. Of course, Simmel failed to see that the basis of these religious needs was the social being of capitalism, whose essential determining factors appeared further heightened in the imperialist period. It was, as Lenin showed, the insecurity of this being. The special nuance which Simmel gave to the religious need similarly arose on this basis. The insecurity manifested to the worker in brute materiality appeared to the bourgeois intellectual in a sublimed, far less direct form. There was an increasingly obvious incongruity between the imperialist period's social being and all the ideological forms which capitalism had produced or, where it suited its needs, taken over from earlier formations. Now for the bourgeois intellectual, this incongruity meant the mixed blessing of a total freedom. It presented the intoxicating feeling of being left wholly to one's own devices on the one hand, and a disconsolate helplessness on the other. And along with the urge to seek within his own ego the standards of all action and behavior, he was faced with a mounting nihilism in respect of all standards. This growing senselessness of individual life brought about the origin of modern religious atheism, of which the Protestant theologian Schleiermacher was a forerunner. For all traditional religious ideas paled in the face of these developments, and yet the world feeling, which dismissed them, preserved the uncritical religious anthropomorphism which Feuerbach did most to expose. In pre-war imperialism, the elements of insecurity, which appeared in purely intellectual forms, still occupied the forefront of the bourgeois intelligentsia's ideology. The elements of the ecstasy of freedom, of liberation from old bonds, still formed the dominant pole in the dichotomy of this world feeling, a dichotomy which was present even then. Only when the first imperialist war shook the foundations in a manner felt by everyone, only when the great economic crisis of 1929 destroyed hopes that the relative stabilization would endure, did the pole of despairing nihilism become the central focal point of philosophy. Simmel's new view of religion was based, therefore, on religious being, which was a form of the whole of vital life itself. Through perceiving it, contemporary man glimpsed the possibility that out of its substantiality, its link with transcendent contents, religion becomes by back or upward formation an intrinsic form of life itself and of all its contents. 33. Thus vitalistic nihilism was intended to provide the basis for a seasonable form of religiosity. This attitude was, considered in purely epistemological terms, a logical continuation of neo-Kantian tendencies. Neo-Kantianism, besides rejecting the perceptibility of an objective reality independent of consciousness, had constantly ensured religion a place in the philosophical world picture. Here Simmel was doing just that. But in the same way as he went beyond the revival, prompted by Dilthey, of Schleiermacher's religious subjectivism, so too he went beyond its neo-Kantian acknowledgement. The particular note struck by Simmel lay, as we have seen, in the fact that while he radically separated the religious attitude from a connection with any kind of content, he viewed this attitude as creating an autonomous world independent of and equivalent to the other worlds likewise created by human subjectivity. And so Simmel's philosophy merged with that stream of religious atheism which found its first major philosophical formulations in Schopenhauer and above all in Nietzsche, whose ethico-philosophical consequences effectively emerged on a European scale in Dostoevsky's oeuvre, Kirillov, Ivan Karamazov, etc. And which became a question central to the interpretation of the world in the later existentialism. The old atheism, by and large closely connected with mechanical materialism, had always been a pure negation of religiosity altogether. But in line with the evaporation of those hopes of social revolution which had animated the French materialists, and whose echo was still discernible in the pre-1848 Feuerbach, it either became totally empty and shallow, Buckner, etc. or it acquired a note of desperation. Naturally, all these views had been already long refuted at the time in Marxism. But this fact had no influence on bourgeois thinking, chiefly for the reason that all the problems of religious atheism had stemmed from the bourgeoisie's social being in capitalism, which was why all solutions transcending bourgeois horizons were a closed book to the ideologists of the bourgeois class. The assimilation into the bourgeoisie of the workers' aristocracy and bureaucracy even prevented such solutions from affecting the workers' movements of Central and Western Europe. Despite the ignorance of Marxism's real views on the religious question, here again the vitalistic modification of religious atheism included, objectively speaking, an attempt to repel the influence of dialectical and historical materialism on the bourgeois intelligentsia. In particular, it attempted to destroy all hopes of a purposeful life within the human community and of a social answer to the loneliness of the bourgeois individual. It was, let us remember, this loneliness in which vitalism, whilst elaborating on the tragedy of it, perceived the highest value of civilized life. Thus religious atheism was the product of a situation in which scientific findings had totally alienated large circles of the intelligentsia from the official churches and religions. On the other hand, this intelligentsia's social situation nonetheless awakened a religious need whose essential content may be summed up as follows. In itself, and considered immanently, my individual life is completely meaningless. The external world does not offer me a meaning, for scientific knowledge has desanctified the world, while the standards of social intercourse do not provide a signpost, so where can I now discover the meaning of my life? Naturally, bourgeois philosophy could not provide the individual with an answer, for it summed up in theory, after all, the very questions which capitalism's social being had posed for the bourgeois individual in an unanswerable form. The purely agnosticistic answer from positivism could have adequate validity only in times and for class sectors in and for which the uncertainty, the meaninglessness of life in capitalism had not yet become obvious. But the imperialist period was increasingly bringing this uncertainty and meaninglessness to the forefront. Hence the withering of positivism among the elite of the bourgeois intelligentsia, and hence that need for Weltanschauung from which vitalism emanated and which vitalism promoted. Of course vitalism could no more provide a real answer than could positivism. As in other spheres, it only brought about a sprouting of agnosticism into mysticism, enveloping the agnostics clear ignorabimus in the party-colored rags of an individualistic, subjective mythology. So all that it achieved in this sphere was that the socially determined psychological state we have described appeared to be dictated as universally philosophical in general or historico-philosophical. Thus the spiritual state acquired first and foremost philosophical sanction, a justification of its perennial nature. Here originated, moreover, a philosophical linking of questions of conduct, and primarily that of morality, with the, largely negative, world picture thus provided. In Nietzsche and the characters of Dostoevsky this gave rise to the morality of everything is permitted on the one hand, and, on the other, the claim that in a world without a God, or in one which God has abandoned, man can and must become God. Thus religious atheism cultivated both sides of modern Nietzscheanism, both the repeal of all the old socio-ethical laws, which however were no longer replaced by fresh ones but autonomously appointed by sovereign individuality, and the apprehension of objective reality, especially the socio-historical world, as nihility. Both aspects, in continuing the Nietzschean proposition, had serious consequences for later developments. They led to the heroic pessimism, the heroic realism of pre-fascist and fascist philosophy. With Simmel himself, we can observe in this respect a moderating, if anything, of the shrillness of Nietzsche and the characters of Dostoevsky. Sovereign individualism expressing itself in its religiosity without a God, although an acknowledgement of nihility in objective reality, nevertheless led, as we shall see later, to a self-indulgent compliance with the tragedy of human civilization. Here Simmel was voicing the basic mood of the imperialist period before the First World War. The insolubly problematical nature of life was already palpable, but life in the midst of these problems was quite agreeable and one could feel at one's ease. Vitalism supplied the clear conscience. The philosophical cushion. Here we clearly see Simmel's inclination to turn the period's extreme relativism into a philosophy, to give modern agnosticism in mythical dress a positive slant. That he belonged to a different generation from Dilthey is shown even more markedly in the concrete achievement. To Dilthey modern economics and sociology were still wholly alien. With Simmel they were central concerns during his first period, and they had repercussions lasting until the end of his work. The task now facing him consisted of interpreting the problems of the capitalist culture of imperialism in a philosophically positive sense. For that reason Simmel no longer ignored historical materialism. He contested, in a most vulgar and superficial way, the materialism in it as well as its concrete historico-social inferences, but he ventured to reinterpret the facts ascertained by this method, facts which played a role in the psychology of the intelligentsia in the form of tendencies towards an anti-capitalist cultural critique. These facts he attempted to incorporate in the idealist outlook of vitalism and to reconcile with conventionally imperialist theories of history. Methodologically, this was essentially a deepening process. Social reality itself and its concrete socio-economic principles were portrayed as a mere manifestation of a universal cosmic order, thereby losing their concrete substance as well as their revolutionary bite. In the introduction to his philosophy Degeld Sim 01L formulated this task as a matter of constructing a basement underneath historical materialism such that the inclusion of economic life in the causes of spiritual culture retains its explanatory value, but such that those very economic forms are recognized as the product of profounder estimations and currents of psychological, indeed metaphysical hypotheses. 34 There thus originated with Simmel a broad, highly effective and influential philosophy of culture. It was designed to comprehend sociologically the specific features of the present and thereupon to incorporate them in deeper, philosophical thinking. Here again, Simmel proceeded in a radically subjectivist manner. What interested him in economics was only the subjective reflex of definite, economically conditioned situations. Since these were immediately evoked by categories pertaining to the surface of economic life, he gave all his attention to these without considering their true economic dependence and function. In so doing and precisely as a result of his depth, he came quite close to the vulgar economics of imperialism. The same applies to Simmel's sociology, where he was concerned only with the immediate and most abstract relational categories of social life, assiduously avoiding all serious problems of content. In his concrete analysis of individual phenomena, Simmel was a pupil of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Nietzsche, to be sure, to far greater effect than his teacher had developed a new philosophical theory of method for the defense of the established order. Before their time, apologetics on behalf of capitalism had proceeded from its supposed ultimate harmony and had stamped the illogicalities and dissonances of existence as surface manifestations, as mere transitory foreground phenomena. But for the new apologetics of Schopenhauer and especially Nietzsche, the world as essentially contradictory and divided nature was at the same time its ultimate ground. With Schopenhauer, this gave rise to a pessimism whereby the meaninglessness of universal substance drowned every single disharmony of the present. All attempts to improve our real world appeared meaningless. The established order was defended from the angle of the senselessness of the universe. On the one hand, Nietzsche extended this pessimism in the context of a great historical myth. He historicized Schopenhauer into myth. And on the other hand, he inferred from this pessimistic interpretation of the world's basis an active affirmation of capitalism quid meme, rejecting all revolutionary positions as decadence and slave morality. Thus in Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, complicated indirect apologetics replaced ordinary, direct apologetics on behalf of the established order. Theirs amounted to a credo quia absurdum in relation to the prevailing social order. As heir to Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, Simmel never tried simply to deny the illogical and problematical nature of contemporary culture, as was the wont of the vulgar apologists. He contested not even the most repugnant phenomena, and not even those current imperialist tendencies which were culturally unfavorable. Precisely here, on the contrary, he seemingly went the whole hog and endowed the problem with a deeper perspective by representing the concrete, socio-economic problems of culture as the manifestation of a universal tragedy of culture in general. This tragedy, according to Simmel, rested on the antithesis of soul and mind, on the antithesis of the soul and its own products and objectifications. Dilthey too represented culture, the objective spirit, as something surpassing experience, therein revealing the illogicality and limitation of the psychological method. This situation appeared to be an objective antinomy of the philosophical methodology, an antinomy which Simmel showed great energy in making a central issue. Thereupon vitalism's central problem, the antithesis of rigid and alive, appeared in a new concrete form. Simmel wrote, everything which is a product of the mind, everything which the continuing life process has rejected as its result has something rigid and prematurely finished about it in relation to this directly live, creative reality. With mind, life has run into a cul-de-sac. But the remarkable thing is that this really miserable portion, which has no room at all for the full richness of subjective life, is, on the other hand, nevertheless perfection. Quote 35 The objective spirit therefore possessed its own logic. Although its formation sprang from individuals' most personal and inward spontaneity, once they had done so they went their own ways. The capitalist division of labor and above all money were, according to Simmel, formations of this kind. The fetish character which Marx assigns to economic objects in the era of mercantile production is only a specially modified case of this general fate of our cultural contents. Thus a deepening of historical materialism consisted in this subsumption of its findings under the vitalistic program, represented in this instance as an indissoluble opposition between subjectivity and cultural construction, between soul and mind. According to Simmel, this opposition was the true tragedy of culture. Here the basic tendency is plain, that of inflating elements of the imperialist epic specific to the situation of the individual and to the eternal, tragic conditions of culture in general. This deepening process had very diverse but converging consequences. Above all, it distracted attention from the concrete economic situation and concrete socio-historical causes. Although economics and sociology were dealt with in broad terms, they lost their independence and even their priority. They were presented, rather, as superficialities which men of a deep disposition had at all costs to exceed. It is, for example, very characteristic that when discussing both Goethe and Nietzsche, whose features he falsified in each case, Simmel emphasized that they had always distanced themselves from all social problems. 37 So by dint of this philosophical generalization, the intelligentsia's anti-capitalist discontent was perverted into self-satisfaction, complacency and narcissism. After Simmel had revealed all the problems related to a monetary culture that he could see, he found something to commend in these very problems. The factual substance of life, he stated, is growing more and more matter of fact and impersonal in order that the unobjectifiable remainder of life may become all the more personal, something all the more indisputably peculiar to the first person. Quote 38 Thus money was of benefit to pure inwardness. Money was presented nothing less than the guardian of inwardness, which may now develop within its intrinsic limits. This apophthegm exposes the tragic condition of culture as the philosophy of parasitical imperialist capitalism. Simmel's vitalistically revised Kantianism served a parasitical aim. The remodeling of Kant had its chief purpose the removal of all bourgeois revolutionary elements from his philosophy, on the grounds that they were historically outmoded. Kantian ethics, the freedom of essentially homogeneous individuals, were for Simmel merely a correlate of the world concept mechanistically based on understanding. And the two had grown obsolete together. After Goethe, Schleiermacher and Romanticism, ran the argument, one had the ethics of the uniqueness of the individual, which replaced all Kantian ideals of equality. The social and moral equality of human beings was thus presented as a purely time-conditioned and already outmoded element of Kantian ethics. Here it was Simmel's intention to prove that his conception of the uniqueness of the personality and its liberty as a new foundation for morality did not turn this freedom into a relativist anarchistic chaos. For the unique individuals would, he asserted, be mutually complementary. Here, while avowedly only interpreting Kant in the spirit of the times, he achieved a total break with Kant's ethics, whose abstract demands were a theoretical reflection of the bourgeois democratic revolution. Certainly Simmel was in the right when he referred to the historically conditioned character of these ethics. The real historical step beyond Kant, however, was the concrete, economic abolition of social classes to be realized by socialism after the overthrow of capitalist society. Now when Simmel pointed to the temporal limitation of Kantian ethics, he did so in the name of the parasitical, privileged intelligentsia of the imperialist period, on behalf of an aristocratic morality à la Nietzsche, who regarded the crowd as unworthy of an ethical study. The only difference between them was that Nietzsche stated this aristocratic bias in an overt, reactionary militant manner, whereas Simmel, in accordance with the pre-war social situation, contented himself with a haughty aloofness from the crowd. We have already touched on his further remodeling tendency, that is, the total subjectification of Kantian a priori. Simmel presents us with a juxtaposition of the various a priori worlds, and philosophy is to a certain extent a genre theory of this juxtaposition. This constituted a further heightening of the relativism of Dilthey's doctrine of types. For Simmel, life formed the ultimate unity as against this fragmentation into umpteen autonomous worlds. I place myself in the concept of life as the center. From that point the way leads to the soul and the first person on the one hand, and to the idea, the cosmos, the absolute on the other. Life appears to be the most extreme objectivity to which we, as subjects with souls, may penetrate directly the farthest and most permanent objectification of the subject. With life we stand centrally situated between the first person and the idea, between subject and object, person and cosmos. Single quote 39 Here life has already become a purely mythical concept and has discarded all relation to scientific biology. Vitalism thereby advanced a step further along the road to anti-scientific thinking. To be sure, Simmel, like Dilthey, only in a heightened form, was still consciously concerned with a reconstruction of science. His struggle against law and causality still took the form of an attempt to work out an epistemological concept of individual causality. But the irrationalistic and anti-scientific bias was far more salient than in Dilthey. Everything that can be proved may also be challenged. Only the unprovable is beyond dispute. The central position of life and its sense within Simmel's philosophy lent a new depth perspective to the antinomy he saw in culture. It involved not only a general antithesis between the currents of life and the delimitations of the mind, for both principles were carried into the living ego. It is not that we are divided into unlimited life and the limits of secured form, living partly in continuity and partly in individuality, with the two states neutralizing each other. These two principles are at odds in the ego itself. Life's paradox, that it can only be accommodated in forms, and yet cannot be accommodated in forms, is every ego's fundamental problem. Hence the fundamental feature of life for Simmel was, the transcending of its own self. 41 Life. Each life is at the same time surplus life and more than life. So the tragedy of culture was represented as only a manifestation of B ultimate illogicality of life itself. Simmel formulated for our epoch that antithesis previously conceived to be beyond time as follows. Perhaps our present life includes too much ego on the one hand, and too much that is mechanical on the other. It is not yet pure life. 42. But just as Simmel had, in presenting the tragic condition of society and culture, penetrated only as far as a tragic conflict and had then given it a pacific, parasitical slant, so he now slanted the question of life's ultimate philosophical illogicality. Let us quote his last piece of worldly wisdom from his posthumous private notes. For the deeper man there is one possibility only of entering life, a certain degree of superficiality. For were he to ponder over all the contradictory, irreconcilable impulses, duties, endeavors and longings too deeply, and to register them as completely and absolutely as both their and his nature demands, he would be bound to explode, become crazy, run away from life. Beyond a certain limit of depth, the lines of being, volition and moral feeling collide so radically and violently that they would inevitably tear us apart. Only by not allowing them beyond that mark can one keep them sufficiently separated for life to be possible. Single quote 43 Schopenhauer and Nietzsche had founded those indirect apologetics which defended the capitalist system by acknowledging and stressing its bad aspects, but inflated them at the same time into cosmic paradoxes. In Simmel, they were publicly declared bankrupt. Though perspicacious enough to see the insoluble nature of the paradoxes, he was far too much an ideologist of imperialist parasitical capitalism to meet a tragic fate in consequence. On the contrary, his vitalism's esoteric morality was a deliberate evasion of ultimate consequences. Exoterically, their teeth were drawn in a gesture of reconciliation. The superficiality for which vitalism asked established a crumb of comfort for man's soul and the nihilistic self-dissipation of relativism. Thus this Emilian variety of relativism and skepticism introduced something new into the German philosophical consciousness: complacent cynicism. With Simmel himself, this was still a product of his philosophical methodology, a moral reflection of the situation of his philosophical endeavors under the conditions of Wilhelm in Germany. From a mixture of purely theoretical radicalism and absolute conformity, in practice, to conditions which could never have stood up to criticism, there came about this sapping of the thinking personality even in such lively and gifted men as Simmel. This was a general symptom of the age, a situation of social security accompanied by a thinking and feeling for which there was no longer anything absolute, any really objective object. It was a situation of inwardness supported by might, as Thomas Mann neatly characterized it. With Spengler, Simmel's involuntary cynicism grew into a frivolous dilettantism elevated to a methodology, and thereupon made devastating and destructive inroads on the scientific spirit of philosophy. And thence the development rapidly continued up to fascism. Simmel himself was, in the direct sense, no more than Dilthey a pioneer of this decline of scientific honesty in philosophy, or of its replacement through a cynical playing with deliberately contrived myths. But he did allow his juggling with intellectual points to lead to conscious, sometimes openly cynical compromises. Hence the process of dissolution is already manifested at a far more advanced stage in Simmel than in Dilthey. 4. War and post-war period. This line of vitalism's development was rudely interrupted by the break of the First Imperialist War. On the day that war was declared, nearly the whole of intellectual Germany learned differently. The resignedly contemplative voices of vitalism fell silent, and a publicistic philosophy arose to argue the case for imperialistic aggression and the world-conquering aims of Wilhelm in Germany. It goes without saying that vitalism too participated in this general change of tack. Despite the superficiality of these wartime products, despite their total worthlessness and insignificance from a philosophical viewpoint, they were nevertheless of import as the beginnings of a new phase in German vitalism. The old basic antithesis of life versus rigidity and the moribund was naturally preserved, but it acquired a new and seasonable content. The German character which was to restore the world's health now constituted the life, conception, and the national character of other peoples was what was moribund and rigid. And in particular, there arose the new equations and antitheses of war as equaling life, and of peace as the rigid and moribund. The publicistic catchwords of this ephemeral writing soon faded, and the crisis of the lost war buried the whole of this babble beneath its ruins. But we can discern in this philosophically worthless literature an important prelude to the second decisive change of course in vitalism, the turn to fascism. Theoretically, this warmongering, aggressively imperialistic philosophical writing offered little that was important. To give a single example, let us just mention the war pamphlet by Max Scheler, with whose philosophy we shall concern ourselves later. In that pamphlet the vital root of war in human nature itself was emphasized as strongly as possible so as to discredit any economic interpretation of the war. Hence the affirmation of war was given a vitalistic reasoning a la Nietzsche. The true root of all war lies in the fact that a tendency towards ascent, growth and development is inherent in all life itself. Everything that is moribund and mechanical seeks only to maintain itself. Whereas life is growing or decaying. In an immediate sense, vitalistic wartime literature soon disappeared without trace. Nonetheless, it signified a decided change in the development of vitalism. The collapse of the war was not, however, the only cause of the change. The First Imperialist War also meant the first major, lasting, world historical victory of socialism, and this victory entailed a fundamental change in vitalism. We have noted with Nietzsche how socialism became the chief adversary in, and the target of, irrationalist philosophy's crucial struggle. We have already observed how Simmel continued these polemics, in, to be sure, a form modified to suit the times, in the pre-war period. With the triumph of the 1917 October Revolution this ideological struggle by Germany's imperialistic bourgeoisie, and with it vitalism, entered upon a new phase. The extent of the change, as well as the nature of its most important consequences with regard to methodology and content, finds its clearest illustration in Oswald Spengler's famous two-volume work, The Decline of the West. It had such a powerful and lasting effect because Spengler gave this change its most radical expression. It was the representative work of this phase and at the same time a veritable, direct prelude to fascist philosophy. Spengler's philosophical level is essentially inferior to that of the previous leaders of vitalism, and that was no accident. We have been able to observe more and more distinctly this lowering of philosophical standards in the course of our studies so far. The more that the new enemy, socialism, became the focal point of their polemics, the more the irrationalists were faced with a problem of whose true content they understood nothing and, for the most part, did not care to understand anything. And to the same degree, their arguments dispensed with a real, scientific knowledge of the object and also, in the majority of cases, with intellectual honesty, the bona fides. But it is highly likely that Spengler's influence in general was related to this diminution of standards. Basically, vitalism's new phase was distinguished by the fact that the degrading of the scientific method, which was hitherto partly half-conscious, partly tactfully concealed and at first sought only to obtain room for vitalism's intuitive irrationalist worldview alongside the established, materially unquestioned individual sciences, now went over to an open attack upon the scientific spirit in general, upon the competence of reason adequately to treat of important human questions. This bias towards a firm separation from the scientific method inevitably introduced a dilettantish element into its exponent's mode of thinking and presentation. With Spengler, this became a conscious methodology, and one which had serious consequences for later developments. For in that, as we shall see, he rejected causality and laws, recognizing them as only the historical phenomena of given epochs and denying them any competence for scientific and philosophical methodology, and in that he substituted analogy for causality. He made a sporting with similarities the canon of investigation. Moreover, he made all fields of human knowledge subservient to his philosophy of history, no matter whether he personally had truly mastered them or whether they, in themselves, had already yielded unequivocal, philosophically applicable results. And this meant that all the time, he had to proclaim as a method a dilettantish playing with analogies, a readjustment of the facts. Measured by the standard of Dilthey or even Simmel, therefore, Spengler nothing more than an amateur, often ingenious but mostly shallow and frivolous. At all events the amateurism did not damage Spengler's general and far-reaching influence, even on the international scale. On the contrary, it was just this which gave rise to his unscrupulously cynical candor, his cheerful boldness in making uncritical generalizations. Precisely in this respect he was infinitely superior to his like-minded contemporaries. Spengler aimed at creating a universal science from history. In Spengler, Dilthey's historical relativism was transformed from a bias that Dilthey himself constantly, though unsuccessfully, labored to overcome into the avowed basis for the conception. The pre-war Neo-Kantians had evolved a special philosophical epistemology for the science of history in order to prove it of equal standing to the natural sciences. This consisted of the rigorous elimination of any kind of laws from history. On account of their less exact laws, extreme positivism had pronounced the historical sciences to be sciences of an inferior rank, and many positivist sociologists were striving to prove the unaltered governance of natural laws in history. In this situation, Wendell Band and Rickert in their scientific doctrine had simply canonized the reactionary praxis of Rank and his successors. In substance that meant, on the one hand, the removal of the idea of progress from history, and on the other, the elevation of the uniqueness and unrepeatability of all historical events and constructions to the sole essence of historical science. Certainly this uniqueness and unrepeatability is a real element of the historical framework. If, however, it is inflated into the sole determining factor of what is historical, and if all elements of law are banished from history, there will come about a reactionary distortion and perversion, an irrationalizing of history, the destruction of its reasoned and orderly nature. Although Wendell Band and Rickert were not deliberate irrationalists in their general philosophy, they did irrationalism's development with regard to history a great service nonetheless. For the value relation through which Rickert tried to secure a certain rationality for historical connections could only establish a pseudo-objectivity. This was especially so in view of the inevitable instability and subjectivity of that which the historical methodology of bourgeois philosophy understood in the concrete instance by valid worth, as also of the manner in which that methodology could realize the relatedness of the unique historical phenomenon to such values. With Simmel, this association with irrationalism already became consciously intended, although even he still sought to establish an individual causality and had not yet wholly given up the standpoint of a modicum of rationality. And with Spengler, all this amounted to the unquestioned dominance of the subjectivist relativistically reasoned historical categories over even mathematics and natural science. Spengler's epistemology was therefore only a means of rounding off the victory of extreme historical relativism. It was an extremely primitive theory resorting to catchwords and catchphrases. It simply applied to history the old vitalistic antithesis of life and death, intuition and reason, form and law, simile and concept, symbol and formula have a very different organ. What we have here is the relationship of life and death, of procreating and destroying. The understanding, the concept kills in the act of perceiving. The artist, the genuine historian intuits how something comes à bout. Single quote 45. Here we can readily see how industriously Spengler, through simplification, fashioned popular slogans for the absolute rule of the vitalistic standpoint out of the pre-war methodology of history. Here the Delvean method of perception through men of genius was already burgeoning into a sharply anti-scientific, aristocratic epistemology. With this epistemology Spengler intended to degrade all causal and law-controlled knowledge. The means of grasping dead forms is the mathematical law. The means of understanding live forms is the analogy. Single quote 46. Spengler now extended analogy, as the central category of history, into the method of a universal morphology, into a symbol system, a physiognomy of history. He recognized as forerunners of this new method Goethe, whom he interpreted from a purely vitalistic angle and hence falsified, and Nietzsche, who had now attained to maximum influence. There was also a smattering of Bergson, whom Spengler simplified as vigorously as he simplified Dilthey and Simmel. Cause and effect, whose framework Spengler called the logic of space, 47 were to be replaced in history by the framework of destiny, the logic of time. Thus he achieved the identification of a rationalist life and history. Life is the alpha and omega, and life has no system, no program, no rationality. It exists for itself and through itself, and the profound order in which it realizes itself can only be intuited and felt, and then perhaps described. Single quote 48. Thus he declared history to be a universal science and, in the same breath, denied it any scientific character. The wish to treat of history scientifically is, in the last analysis, always a paradoxical thing. 49. This shallow and arbitrary epistemology in which everything boiled down to experience, to intuition, was Spengler's way of asserting the undisputed mastery of historical relativism. Everything is historical. With Spengler that meant that everything was historically relative, purely relative. Whereas the methodology of pre-war German imperialism had allotted to the natural sciences an isolated place in a kind of national trust area of rationality, Spengler sought to historicize the whole knowledge of nature, that is, to subordinate it to historical relativism. Here again the issue itself, namely that of regarding nature historically, of conceptualizing the historicity objectively present in nature, was not invented by vitalism but had been raised by the evolution of society and the natural sciences. But Spengler also turned this question irrationalistically upside down. For him, it was not to do with the historical character of the real process in nature, but with a pseudo-historical dissolving of the objectivity of all natural scientific categories. With vitalism's assistance, this question could not but succumb to an increasingly radical relativism and also to a mysticism which was becoming more and more audacious and uncontrolled. The question of a historical treatment of nature had been in the air since Darwin, and indeed since the Kant Laplace theory. The natural philosophies of the young Schelling and of Kant were bold attempts to answer it, albeit with totally inadequate to less than, greater than ls. Here Spengler reversed the proposition in a subjectivist vitalistic manner. While ignoring the objectively historical evolution of nature, he historicized knowledge of nature by making it a mere function of the character type of a given cultural cycle. This historicizing therefore removed all nature's independence and autonomy, thus causing the complete disappearance of the genuine problem, the historical being of nature itself within objective natural laws. Certainly we must not forget that, again, a genuine problem lay hidden behind even this totally distorted proposition, namely how and to what extent the historical evolution of society affects the compass, character, etc. of our perception of nature. But Spengler dismissed from consideration the necessary basis for the correct proposition, the objectivity of nature and evolution of the productive forces of a given society, and the stage in the growth of science and technology which they determine. By making an absolute principle of the element of historical relativity in our perceptions of nature, he likewise eliminated the fact of their progressive approximation to nature's objective reality. Not acknowledging the interaction between the evolution of productive forces and perceptions of nature, he intuitively derived the separate forms or results of natural science directly from the morphological form of a cultural cycle. And in so doing, he engendered a myth based on the radical and permanent relativity of all knowledge. Spengler did not, in the process, shrink from making the most daring assertions. In many respects he owed his sudden and widespread influence to this fondness for startling paradoxes. Number, for instance, was for him a purely historical category. A number in itself does not and cannot exist. There are several worlds of numbers, because there are several civilizations. We find an Indian, Arabic, ancient and Occidental type of number, each at bottom unique, each the expression of a different course of events. Accordingly there is more than one kind of mathematics. Quote 50 This ridiculously consistent denial of all objectivity Spengler took to the point where he was capable of saying of causality that it was an Occidental and more precisely a Baroque phenomenon. 51 For Spengler, history took precedence over nature as a general rule, thus history is the original world form and nature a late one which only men of a mature culture may fulfill, not the reverse as a prejudice in urban scientific understanding tends to assume. Quote 52 And so the whole science of physics along with its object was a myth of the late Occidental Faustian culture. The atom, speed of light and gravitation were just as much the mythical categories of Faustian man as poltergeists and household demons were categories of the period that believed in magic. 53 For those reasons, culture was for Spengler the primary phenomenon of all past and future world histories. 54 We have noted already that in Spengler's view, culture provided the organon for a consistent relativizing of all phenomena. But in now proclaiming a world history to be a universal science, he also abolished the unitary character of world history. Spengler ardently polemicized against the division of history into antiquity, the medieval period and the modern age. These periods, to be sure, had become a pure convention in the study of history, which failed to recognize for the most part that its real objective foundation lay in the great economic formations of slavery, serfdom and hired labor. It might seem as if Spengler's polemics were aimed against this convention, but that was only immediately and apparently so. For it is no accident that such attacks, such fundamental revisions to the whole construction of world history ensued only at that stage of irrationalism at which the latter took up arms against socialism. To the bourgeois concept of progress as formulated in, say, Hegel's philosophy of history and later, suitably ironed out, in Anglo-French liberal sociology, ranks elevation to a principle of the absence of ideation and its philosophical transfiguration through neo-Kantianism offered an adequate answer. But the bourgeois historical theorists found their situation thoroughly altered when historical materialism presented the major periods of history as an orderly succession of social formations and proved that the economic laws of their change led to the higher formations of socialism. Chamberlain and Spengler just drew the most rigorous conclusions from this position. The only effective challenge to the notion of socio-historical progress lay in denying the unitary and ordered character of the course of history and human evolution in general. Although the immediate, surface polemics may have been aimed against the pedantic tripartite scheme, citing as an argument the discovery of Oriental cultures which had indeed been overlooked, this was only shadow boxing. For historical materialism was able to elucidate their development too in economic terms and to trace a, admittedly tortuous, orientation of content from primitive communism to socialism. Therein lay the true target of Spengler's polemics. From the concretely methodological angle, Spengler's view of culture as a primary phenomenon was tantamount to saying that there were several qualitatively different cultures each of which evolved in its own way in every respect. Here we can clearly see how the Dilthean concept of the type grew into a myth. The relativistic basic character of Dilthey's typological conception was, if anything, heightened further. Dilthey's dream of a philosophical synthesis that would remove the rigid relativism of topology was thoroughly discredited. For Spengler, the topology of cultures constituted their ultimate and sole fundamental perception. The radicalization which exaggerated the relativistic element in topology also marked the point at which it tipped over into myth. With Dilthey, topology was an auxiliary tool of historical knowledge whose value was only established in the elucidation of historical reality. In calling his types primary phenomena, Spengler was responsible for much more than a terminological innovation. He declared the form of each culture to be the real basis of all its separate manifestations, in content as in form, in structure as in dynamics. The scientific auxiliary construction had become a concrete ground, albeit irrationalist in principle and comprehensible only via intuition. The automatic result was that these self-enclosed forms were necessarily monades without windows, only within its unique essence could each be intuitively grasped and described. But Spengler, as we have seen, was unwilling to stop at a mere description of his unique forms. After juxtaposing them in mutual exclusiveness, he wanted to reveal connections between them after all. It is however plain that these could not possibly be of a scientific character. In the worst, anti-scientific traditions of Romanticism, Spengler found for this another intuitive, irrationalist category. Manifestations of different cultures were comparable only by analogy. For example, Euclidean geometry as a manifestation of antiquity compared to non-Euclidean geometry as a manifestation of Occidental culture. Historical morphology now ascertained definite and necessarily recurring stages in all cultural development. Every culture goes through the different ages of individual men. Each has its childhood, youth, adult life and old age. Single quote 55 Now since, according to Spengler, each culture proceeded to evolve on these lines towards an inevitable destiny, there arose a new and, for Spengler, crucial category. I am naming simultaneously two historical facts which, each in its own culture, appear in exactly the same relative situation and therefore have a precisely corresponding significance. 56 Thus Archimedes and Gauss, Polygnot and Rembrandt, etc., were contemporaries. This was the ancient and hackneyed dictum of the successive ages of civilization. But as voiced in Ficco, Herder and Hegel before the origin of historical materialism, it did show at least an inkling of the ordered rise and decline of social formations, whereas Spengler turned it into an occasionally ingenious but mostly downright false juggling with unreasoned analogies. This view had, however, become important for the later course of events. In the first place, it denied the unified evolution of the human race, and this denial later became a dogma in the fascist interpretation of history based on racial theory, which admittedly owed more to Chamberlain than to Spengler. Secondly, it made for a new and, from the propaganda angle, effective challenge to historical progress. As we have seen, pre-war vitalism already had a major share in contesting the idea of progress from a reactionary and skeptical standpoint. Here Spengler's paradoxy, original in form and trivial in content, did no more than draw all the conclusions. We have already seen that Spengler's struggle against socialism as the chief enemy formed the social basis of this more advanced stage of the irrationalist denial of all historical progress. And thirdly, the Spenglerian theory of forms with regard to individual cultures gave rise at this point to a solipsism of cultural cycles. With Spengler, the vitalistic and irrationalistic anthropomorphizing of cycles of culture was not limited to ascribing to them a growth and an aging. They also acquired the inner psychological structure of humans of the imperialist period. They lived in a solipsistic fashion. This solipsism, as a mode of feeling of the imperialist age's parasitical classes, had hitherto expressed itself openly only in the psychology of the decadent belles letters of the time. As we have noted, it governed the epistemology of most of vitalism's exponents, but largely tacitly and hidden behind a mythical pseudo-objectivity. At this point Spengler, since these forms had acquired an overt and fully developed mythical pseudo-objectivity, also allowed these features of the solipsistic relation to the world to emerge overtly and fully developed. In principle each cultural cycle can experience only itself. There exists no bridge of mutual understanding whatever between one cycle and another. The definition of this inner structure of Spengler's forms is of importance chiefly for the light it sheds on the imperialist myth's inner historical substance. They claim to unearth at last primeval, scattered connections, but in reality they constituted nothing more than the insertion of the psychology of the imperialistic age as parasitical intelligentsia into a suitably adjusted, purportedly historical reality. But this definition also has a forward-looking significance. The solipsistic character of historical forms was the methodological prototype for fascist racial theory. The philosophical substantiation of the fascist precept of barbaric inhumanity towards those of other races was built on the conception of such a solipsistic racial structure. The various races were regarded as just as alien, hostile, hermetic and uncommunicative towards each other as Spengler's cultural cycles. Granted, we shall find that with Gobineau, and to an even greater extent with Chamberlain, racial theory reached this stage under its own power, and we have remarked that Nietzsche was similarly far advanced in this respect. But that does not lessen the significance of the fact that vitalism led to this pass. In the first place, we notice in Spengler the fulfillment of Nietzsche's barbarizing tendencies. In the second, we see the deep-seated concurrent development of the various streams of reactionary imperialist philosophy, and their tendency to merge in theoretical preparation for the barbaric ideas and actions of Hitler and Rosenberg. Similarly, it is patent that the construction of this irrationalist, solipsistic myth of history had as its ultimate, crucial purpose another attempt to resist the socialist perspective on social evolution. Nietzsche, the first to take up this philosophical challenge, was still obliged to present the whole of world history, which was unitary in his eyes, as a contest for leadership between masters and rabble. Therefore he had to lay stress on awakening the masters' will to power with all the available means in order that their struggle might end in the future defeat of socialism. Spengler entertained hopes that were far weaker than Nietzsche's. His conception was a consoling melody rather than a battle hymn, an opiate rather than a stimulus. The cyclical life of the cultural spheres, he thought, had repeatedly given rise to dangers similar to the contemporary one, namely the proletarian threat to capitalism. This danger, however, had been dismissed from every cycle, and each culture had died a natural death of superannuation, of cultural paralysis. Why should a different fate befall the Faustian civilization of capitalism? There was, after all, intuitive analogical morphology, the only sure knowledge of history, and this indicated that destiny was about to introduce the rule of the Caesars. The fact that this rule signified the beginning of the end of the culture concerned did not interest any capitalist or parasitical intellectual. We shall manage to survive Apergenus le deluge, that was Spengler's song of consolation, and very effective it was. Another powerful effect of his oeuvre Spengler owed to the consequences of an overall conception which allotted a central place to the asserted antithesis of culture and civilization. This antithesis had long played a major part in the reactionary German philosophy of history. The ideological battle against Germany's democratization was waged under its flag. By civilization, it meant everything that was bad about capitalism and principally Western democracy, which was now confronted with an autochthonous, organic and genuinely German culture. Here Spengler was uniting reactionary Prussian tendencies with an artificially paradoxical modern form. Again, the problem of civilization acquired a vitalistic slant. It was presented as the problem of decay contrasted with life in full bloom, with culture. The question of the decline of the Western world was this. Every culture has its own civilization. Civilization is a culture's inescapable destiny. Civilization constitutes the most extreme and artificial conditions of which a higher kind of man is capable. These conditions are a final terminus. As things that have come about, they are the sequel to becoming. As death, they are the sequel to life. As paralysis, they are the sequel to evolution. Are an end, irrevocable, but they have always been reached as a matter of the innermost necessity. Single quote 57. In this statement, Spengler answered the question in the spirit of the Prussian reactionary movement. Admittedly, it sounds like a disconsolate answer at first, as the prospect of a fateful paralysis. But, like Nietzsche's pessimistic critique of culture in its day, this gave reassurance to the extreme reactionaries. For it stressed once again that the present was not a revolutionary period which threatened to overthrow German reaction. On the contrary, the prospect of the consolidation of reactionary forces was proved to be irrefutable. For to Spengler's mind, the dominant form of civilization was Caesarism. It was the amorphous method of governance pertaining to every decaying culture, to every civilization. The people were transformed into a peasantry without a history over whom the Caesars erected their dominion, a dominion whereby history reverts to the absence of history, to the primitive beat of prehistory. 58. This, then, was the Spenglerian prospect for the Western world, for the present day, the fateful, irresistibly growing dominion of the Caesars of monopoly capitalism over a merely amorphous mass of peasant proletarians, an undisputed dominion lasting until the end of the Faustian culture. This prospect originated in a pessimistic analysis of the contemporary fate, and it was highly agreeable to the reactionaries. Spengler gave it concrete expression in a specific book which is of importance to fascist ideology, Prussianism and socialism. Here he expounded the morphological, basic idea in the following way. Every civilization, according to Spengler, has its socialism. But this generalization did not satisfy Spengler's analogy hunt. He had, in addition, to discover the real socialism, namely Prussianism, the types of the military officer, civil servant and worker. The adversary of this socialism was not capitalism but England. 59. Prussians and Englishmen represent two major types in the development of civilization. There are two moral imperatives of a contrasting kind, slowly evolved from the Viking spirit and the code of the Knights of the Teutonic Order. The one group carried the Germanic idea within them. The others felt it over them, personal independence and suprapersonal commonalty. Today they are called individualism and socialism. Karl Marx and working-class socialism have only complicated this question and are being thrust aside by the fateful logic of world history. The victor will be Prussian socialism, the socialism founded by Friedrich Wilhelm I. The true internationale will also be built on this basis. A genuine internationale is possible only through the triumph of the idea of a single race above all others. The genuine internationale is imperialism. Single quote 60. The worker, in this socialism, becomes an economic officer, and the entrepreneur a responsible administrative official. The German working class will be bound to realize that only this socialism has real possibilities. No ideology is needed, only a brave skepticism, a class of socialistic master natures. 61. Here, what was new in Spengler as compared with Nietzsche is perfectly clear. The latter had made a direct, frontal assault on socialism, of which he knew little. Of course it cannot be claimed that Spengler was any better acquainted with socialist literature, but his mode of attack was different, a dodging of the issue and a demagogic ruse. Socialism, he conceded, would triumph, but the genuine article was Prussianism. That the historical prospect he outlined here is essentially different from that of the decline of the West will interest only those wishing to see in Spengler a thinker with a coherent system. It seems to us that an important connection, a social one, exists between the two perspectives. If, in his magnum opus, he had rebuffed the prospect of socialism with arguments taken from his theory of cultural morphology, here he sought the intellectual redemption of German imperialist capitalism, with its aristocratic militaristic features, by dubbing it the real socialism. This, however, was already to anticipate the basic idea of Hitlerian social demagogy. Thus we see how close, in the time of the immediate post-war crisis, this reactionary prelude of vitalism turned militant came to fascist ideology. Naturally there were still many elements dividing Spengler from fascism. His racial conception was a Nietzschean one. So too was his concept of dominance. By rejecting all social demagogy, all appeals to the masses, he strongly differed from Rosenberg and Daimler at the time of fascist dominion. But that makes no difference to Spengler's significance in the history of the preliminaries to fascism. By reconstructing vitalism as a philosophy of militant reaction, he completed the change of course which led in a roundabout way to fascism. And notwithstanding all their reservations and polemical comments, the fascist ideologists always acknowledged Spengler's services to them. The vitalistic philosophy of relative stabilization. The ebbing of the revolutionary tide after 1923 marked the start in Germany, as in the whole of Western and Central Europe, of the period of relative stabilization. With its illusory hopes of a long period of economically and politically consolidated, gradual and peaceful development, it also brought different contents and tendencies to the fore in vitalism. Although large sectors, particularly among the petty bourgeoisie, hoped for a return of pre-war times, public opinion among the intelligentsia was increasingly recognizing that so simple a return was objectively impossible. The new conditions engendered by the war and collapse determined a militant politicizing of vitalism, which meant it's going beyond the pacifically parasitical, complacently skeptical, and purely individualistic resignation of the pre-war period. Nevertheless, there arose for the time being a prevalence of thinkers and tendencies that, although still rooted in their essential philosophy and method in pre-war times, sought henceforward to reconcile the dominant philosophical traditions of yesteryear with the new situation. The most important figure in this transitional period was Max Scheler. He was a lively-minded, flexible, versatile writer without firm convictions, very strongly susceptible to whatever was most in vogue. But for all that, he did take a basic line which largely matched the requirements of relative stabilization. It was his desire to found a philosophy rich in content and surpassing neo-Kanti. Formalism, a fixed hierarchy of values suited to playing an important part in the consolidation of German bourgeois society. This meant a resumption, under radically altered circumstances, of the Dilthian philosophical program with which we are already familiar. And Scheler in fact spoke most appreciatively of Dilthey's pre-intuiting genius. 62. His affinity with the latter's tendencies is also evident in the fact that Scheler was far removed from a vitalistic relativism as overtly expressed and radically paradoxical as Spengler's. Indeed, it has sometimes been asked if Scheler can be fully credited with vitalism in the orthodox sense, since his hierarchy of values constantly went beyond life to culminate in higher values than life. Scheler shared with Dilthey the conviction, which he attempted to build up and argue with the intellectual methods of Husserlian phenomenology, that categories, that is, norms, values, etc., were to be organically obtained and developed from a materiality of the philosophical objects intuitively grasped and experienced through intuition of the essence. The intuitive character of this method brought him very close to vitalism. Despite Dilthey's enthusiasm for Husserlian phenomenology, it had hitherto stood apart from vitalism's philosophical tendencies. Husserl himself actually rejected them and strove for a philosophy that was a strict science. 63. But we may go so far as to say that Scheler, with his intuitive mind, led phenomenology into the mainstream of vitalistic irrationalism. To be sure, we should not overestimate the worth of Husserl's rejection of vitalism. Although he acted as though divorced from vitalism's agnosticistic excesses, he turns out to stand quite close to Mashism when he himself takes up basic questions of epistemology. We have only to quote Husserl's exposition of the reality of the external world. The question of the existence and nature of the external world is a metaphysical one. Epistemology, as a general explanation of ideal essence and of the valid meaning of cognitive thinking, does encompass the general question of whether and how far a knowledge or reasoned surmising of concretely real objects is possible, objects transcending in principle the experiences perceiving them, as also the question of the norms to which the true meaning of such cognition would have to conform. But epistemology does not include the empirically slanted question of whether we human beings may truly gain such knowledge on the basis of the data in fact offered to us, or even the task of realizing this knowledge. In our view, epistemology in the proper sense of the word is not a theory at all. It is not a science in the meaningful sense of a unity derived from theoretical explanation. 64 As we are about to show, the Husserlian method of leaving in parentheses the question of the datum of reality implies the same proximity to Mashism. Scheler was a transitional figure, and the period in which he acquired a leading influence was also a transitional one. It marked a temporary breathing space between two major crises in German democracy and its ideologies. Scheler's versatility and impressionable nature made him well qualified to become a central figure of this period. Although originally a pupil of Eucken and subsequently an adherent of Husserl, he promptly tried to enlarge phenomenology in respect of both content and world outlook. His most important pre-war works have as their content the search for immorality of substance, against Kantian formalism and on behalf of objective classification of values. For a long while Catholicizing, hierarchical tendencies reminiscent of scholasticism were still present in this apparent objectivism, tendencies which had been already operative in the logical method of phenomenology since Bolzano and Brentano. The Catholicizing Scheler provides a certain parallel to the social philosophy of Span, and in that radical reactionary currents overtook them during the second post-war crisis, both authors met the same fate. Another sign of Scheler's lability and his impressionable nature is the fact that in his wartime writings, he propounded a vitalistic attack on the English mind first and foremost, more or less along Sombartian lines. During the age of relative stabilization, on the other hand, he developed a considerable open sympathy with contemporary Western culture. During this period, he also attempted to harmonize his objective hierarchy of values with the dominant historical relativism by helping to found a sociology of knowing in which this compromise was central to the methodology. The impending crisis, which Scheler did not live to experience in its acuter phases, cast a pessimistic gloom over his philosophy and increased the weight it gave to anthropological relativism. And the latter increasingly weakened the dogmatics of a classification of values. Whereas at the outset, his ideas of God had almost echoed Aquinas, his philosophy of religion was now gradually shifting to an almost complete godlessness in that he proclaimed a God evolving together with man. In his late period, this doctrine already amounted almost to a semi-religious, semi-atheistic deification of man. So Scheler's attempt to link vitalistic relativism with a fixed classification was only a rather fleeting episode in the development of vitalism up to fascism. But it was not without its significance, for it carried phenomenology along with it into the vitalistic stream. Or to put it more precisely, phenomenology's vitalistic irrationalistic tendencies first emerged openly with Scheler. He made public that which Husserl had concealed by confining his method to problems of formal logic. understanding of historical phenomena was married to Husserl's intuiting of the essence. The timeless proofs of phenomenology were exposed as a mirage as soon as Schiller applied the method to concrete socio-historical phenomena. The profound affinity with the relativism of Dilthey and Simmel came to light. Let us now examine Schiller's phenomenological method rather more closely. Schiller provided a clear picture of it in an essay dating from 1913. Phenomenology is the name for an attitude of intuitive contemplation in which one receives something to intuit or to experience which would otherwise remain hidden. Single quote 65. Here Schiller openly admitted the total subjectivity of the method. What is experienced and intuited is given only in the experiencing and intuiting act itself. In its accomplishment, it appears herein and only herein. Its basic character is the most lively, intensive and immediate. Experiential commerce with the world itself. He was here polemicizing against the well-known Husserl critique by Wilhelm Wundt, who poked fun at the Husserlian mode of presentation by saying that Husserl produced a long series of definitions of what a concept was not, and then finished with a pure tautology, such love is love. Wundt's misunderstanding, according to Schiller, lay in a failure to recognize the phenomenological attitude of mind, which must bring the reader something to intuit which in essence may only be intuited. The whole statement was, Schiller maintained, only a preliminary, and the final tautology was tantamount to, now look, and then you will see it. As these statements show, the phenomenological method had its strongly vitalistic irrationalistic features from the outset. And Schiller remained throughout his life a loyal and grateful pupil of the Husserlian method, always adhering to the phenomenological working method. This method said in parentheses, as Husserl conceived it, every object whose intuitive contemplation was intended. That is to say, it left the object's reality out of consideration in order to attain to a sight of the objective pure essentials unencumbered by the question of the data of reality, and to express this apodictically in a purportedly objective form. This method shows very clearly both facets of the imperialist period's general philosophical development, viz., the close association of intuitivistic irrationalism and pseudo-objectivity. It was an acknowledged fact that the method rested upon intuition, nor did Schiller, as we have just noted, make any attempt to conceal it. Initially, the basically irrationalistic character was masked by the fact that Husserl and his first pupils concerned themselves largely with problems of formal logic, with analyses of meaning. Hence it was possible for Husserl himself to imagine that with phenomenology he had discovered a method of treating philosophy as a strict science. But we must at once point out that formal logic's important position in the methodology by no means precluded irrationalism. On the contrary, although formal logic and irrationalism constitute an antinomy from the philosophical angle, they are nonetheless modes of relating to reality standing in polar coordination. The origin of irrationalism is always closely associated with the limits of the comprehension of the world through formal logic. Case facts which are here adduced as the starting point, as proof and verification of the irrationalistic character of reality will be raised to categories of reason in every dialectical treatment of the contradictory nature of the forms of understanding, of the reflectional conditions. And it is characteristic of the thinkers marking the transition to extreme irrationalism that this conflict, which had made previous appearances in history as a conflict between opposing tendencies, played a decisive role in the internal structure of their philosophy. So, with Schiller too, the ethical hierarchy, although acquiring its real substantiation through intuition, was constructed with the aid of extremely logical considerations and divided into distinct types. This function of formal logic as a kind of conceptual corset for intuitions and irrationalisms may be observed in all the philosophers coming from the Husserl school, even Heidegger. But for all of them, it was only an auxiliary tool. The essential content was irrationalistic to a growing degree, and the decisive, externally non-constructive structural principles were also irrationalistic. The tendency towards pseudo-objectivity was present in phenomenology from the start. But with Husserl, phenomenology seemed at first to be only a renewal of the Bolzano-Brentano tradition. Only when phenomenologies had left the purely logical realm and taken phenomena of social life as the object of essential intuition did the question of true objectivity emerge at its sharpest. And in its later stage of development, phenomenology claimed more and more insistently to be arguing a science of reality, an ontology. Here, however, even within the phenomenological context, it would have been obliged to ask when, and on what conditions, one could remove the parentheses in which the phenomenologically intuited essentials were placed, and where one could locate and register the criterion of whether essential intuition included reality independent of consciousness. But the setting in parentheses radically excluded this question. Essential intuition could be applied not only to a significant correlation, but to a purely imaginary formation as much as to an image of reality. The essence of the setting in parentheses lay precisely in the fact that all these thought formations, so radically different in respect of their relation to reality, were reduced to a common denominator in phenomenological investigation, which took them as being homogeneous. It is clear, therefore, that the whole question of reality, of whether the object remaining after the removal of the parentheses is a mere formation by the consciousness or the image of something with a being independent of consciousness, had become inescapable. Now it is very interesting that this major shift from the investigation of consciousness to the science of being, from phenomenology to ontology, the self-style turning to the facts, was accomplished almost unnoticed. One simply declared the phenomenological objects to be objects of ontology and surreptitiously transformed essential insight into a revival of intellectual intuition. This development characterized the often imperceptibly and gradually but irresistibly mounting strength in post-war imperialism of a thinking oriented to the mythical. Pre-war Neo-Kantian epistemology was avowedly left behind. and at the same time, a reality that was irrational and comprehensible only by intuition was granted automatic evidence for its being on the basis of its purely intuitive comprehensibility. In order to illustrate quite clearly the epistemological hollowness and untenability of the phenomenological method and the ontological method deriving from it, we have deliberately avoided starting with a critique of its hypotheses. A true critique would have to go right back to the setting in parentheses. For it is obvious that this celebrated method tells us nothing more than that, for instance, the idea of man and the idea of the devil are both just ideas. Without logical devices, however, no substantial conclusions can be drawn from so purely formal an identification, and essential insight claim to do just that. Were the phenomenologists to analyze in some measure this central point of their method, they would be forced to recognize that any investigation of an idea with regard to content is impossible without reference to objective reality, no matter whether the procedure is intuitive or discursive. The content can only be obtained by comparing its individual features, coherence and so forth with objective reality, by enriching, complementing, correcting, etc. the original idea through these comparisons. If Schiller, to return to his example, conducts an intuition of the essence with regard to love, then those mental pictures of the objective reality constituting the phenomenon of love must be collected, summed up and collated, and that which does not belong to it excluded. Only then would he be in a position to accomplish his essential insight. In fact, therefore, he will not have set reality in parentheses, but will have constantly referred to it. Setting in parentheses is only a specific method of phenomenology inasmuch as the subjective idealistic or rationalistic arbitrariness of it acquired from the outset a pseudonym giving an impression of objectivity. The relation of the ideas to objective reality is disrupted not only from the epistemological standpoint, but also from that of concrete content, and a method is created that blurs and indeed erases the distinction between true and false, necessary and arbitrary, real and merely imagined. If, say, man and the devil are likewise placed in parentheses, then, by dint of the fact that we are dealing, in a psychologically immediate way, with ideas in both cases, we are overlooking the difference that in determining the content, we are resorting to reality in the first instance, but only to ideas again in the second. This is why phenomenological ontology also fails to investigate the questionable right to open the parentheses. For it introduced them only in order to reduce truth and fiction, reality and myth to a common level, and to create a haze of mythical quasi-objectivity. That method which Husserl declared to be strictly scientific is therefore nothing more than the subjective idealistic statement, it is my ideas which determine the essence of reality. Husserl's epistemological closeness to Mach was no accident. It was just that where the Machists and the Kantians attempted deductions, Husserl contented himself with proclaiming intuitive certainty. Schiller, who admittedly stood at the beginning of this development, claimed along with the whole school to have overcome the Kantians' formalism and subjectivism. How much this method had to do with a subjectivistic arbitrariness surpassing even neo-Kantianism we have just shown, and we can now illustrate the point with a short example from Schiller's major early work of moral philosophy. There he stated, the institution of slavery was not, therefore, an institution permitting the subjugation of persons, but vice versa, because the slave depicted himself not as a person but only, for instance, man, ego, psychical subject and so on, that is, still as a fact, it was normally permissible for him to be killed, sold, etc. 66 Slave consciousness, therefore, did not arise out of the socio-economic institution. On the contrary, it was slave consciousness which created slavery in a society. Here it becomes patent that one may see whatever one chooses by means of the professedly objective intuiting of the essence. 67 We see, then, the extent to which the foundation upon which Schiller sought to build his pyramid of an objective and permanent classification was wrought, and riddled with subjectivistic arbitrariness. All that supplemented mere experiencing was an extremely threadbare formal logic, such as in Schiller's statement that the existence of the positive values was something positive, their non-existence something negative and so forth. In this way such formal logic could produce at best an abstract context. The important factor dictating the content was the subjective arbitrariness of the intuiting, as we have characterized it above. The very definition of the individual types of ethical attitude was therefore arbitrary, and their professedly objective classification thoroughly so. For this, according to Schiller, could never be deduced or inferred. There is for this an intuitive preferential evidence which no kind of logical deduction can replace. 68 So Schiller's ethics gave rise to a purely arbitrary arrangement and hierarchy of types. Schiller included among them the saint, the generalias, the hero, the intellectual leader, and the hedonistic artist, in that order of precedence. Occasionally, to be sure, he stated some quasi-scientific, quasi-objective characteristics, such as whether the one phenomenon was founded on the other, etc. But since these quasi-logical arguments were similarly based on a purely subjective intuition, they could in every instance be reversed at will. Therefore Schiller's ethical doctrine of types was just as much a simple juxtaposition as Dilthey's topology of worldviews, and like Dilthey he was forced to admit that in reality, these types were separated by insoluble contradictions which not even the new worldview could resolve and so establish a really valid order of precedence. Schiller designated this confession of extreme relativism the essential tragedy of all finite personal being and its moral imperfection. 69 No finite person could be simultaneously a saint, hero, genius, etc. Hence every possible conflict of will, that is, every possible dispute between representatives of personal types, eludes settlement through a finite person. Tragic is therefore the word for a dispute whose just settlement is conceivable only through the judgment of the Godhead exclusively. Thus Schiller himself was indicating that his ethics, were they not to dissolve into total relativism, needed supplementing with an ontology of God. And we have already shown how the God whom Schiller grasped phenomenologically underwent a gradual dissolution in the course of the author's development. It is clear that as soon as the social world experienced a real upheaval, the allegedly objective and permanent order of values would be bound to collapse. The subjectivistic, relativistically arbitrary tendency would break through and triumph. The tendency towards dissolution in his own philosophy is visible in Schiller's late works, where an allegedly permanent objectivity no longer ordered the human types and the philosopher had to try and argue everything on overtly anthropological grounds. All forms of being depend on the being of man. The whole objective world and its essential being do not constitute a being in itself, but only a counter-projection and extract from this being in itself, tailored according to man's total mental and physical organization, only from the image of man's essence. May we draw a conclusion to the true attributes of the highest ground of things. 70 Here Schiller was already approaching Spengler's nihilistic skepticism. It is also significant that in the post-war period, he broke with all the Husserlian traditions of strict scientific thought and openly allied himself to the most irrational anti-scientific thinking. Science, he said, has absolutely no significance ontologically for acquiring and establishing a world outlook. 71 So Schiller, like all vitalists, did not go beyond a relativistic doctrine of types. Even Spengler's doctrine of cultural cycles was nothing better than a pompously inflated and, factually considered, superficially historical topology. Schiller's personal character enabled him to give vitalism a slant matching the requirements of relative stabilization. His new and opportune intermediate link was his sociology of knowledge. We shall deal with its individual findings, its specific methodology in connection with an analysis of German sociology in the imperialist period. The one philosophically important element to be established is that Schiller believed, on the one hand, that he could dispose of his increasingly extreme relativism by finding a new term with which to describe it. The new magic word was perspectivism. Schiller revived, on the other hand, the aging Dilthey's illusion, the fictive hope, as though extreme relativism pursued to the farthest limit could engineer its own resolution. But in accordance with the more advanced development of imperialism, Schiller went much further than Dilthey. The latter saw an irremovable relativism only in the judging of historical phenomena. Schiller took the view that the relativism applied to the events themselves. He stated, not only our perception of the historical facts of the case, but also these themselves are relative to being and to being thus, not just to the mere consciousness of the beholder. There is only a metaphysical, not a historical thing in itself. Here Schiller, like Mannheim soon afterwards, was striving to have relativism resolve itself precisely by taking it to its extreme conclusion. On the basis of a superficial analogy, which was then in fashion, with a garbled version of Einstein's theory of relativity, Schiller intended to found a historical perspectivism starting from these hypotheses. This meant the strict denial of all objective existence of the historical facts, and at the same time the dependence of all possible historical images on the substance of the individual moment and the beholder's individual position in absolute time. That is to say, the student of history actually creates it. The task of Schiller's sociology of knowledge in this respect was to furnish historical proof of this relativism, especially through proving the different basic direction of European and Asiatic knowledge in the former, from matter to the soul, in the latter from the soul to matter. Here again we can see that historical perspectivism was serving to discredit Western materialist philosophy as provincial prejudice. This epistemological relativism was given a basis quite superficial enough. A man who, to take a crude example, spends today in Rome, the next day in Paris, and will shortly be in Berlin or Madrid already feels the extended physical world to be less real and substantial on account of the changes of location. The physical world will take on for him an increasingly objective figurative character. 73 So Schiller was aiming at producing a compromise between vitalistic relativism and his objective, permanent hierarchy of values. Hence he met the needs of relative stabilization and came correspondingly closer to specific tendencies of pre-war vitalism. We can almost think that Simmel is speaking when Schiller states, everything that can be mechanized ought to be mechanized. 74 But Simmel's vitalistic precept about money as the guardian of the inner life was still quite a general tenet of faith. With Schiller, in the period of relative stabilization, this bias denoted a stand in favor of a democracy from above, in contrast to the French Revolution's plebeian democracy, and even more to proletarian democracy, and in particular on behalf of the cultural expectations of capitalism entertained by broad sectors of German society during relative stabilization. Schiller viewed the contemporary state of affairs as a battle for a new metaphysics, the origins of which were closely linked to the current politico-social crisis. The sociological form of democracy from below is a whole more foe than friend to all higher forms of knowledge. It is the Democrats of liberal origin who have supported and developed positive scientific thinking first and foremost. The proofs were the revolutionary developments from the peasants' wars to Bolshevism, also the class myths. For Schiller, fascism was also included. They were beacons of a mighty metaphysical need we would do well to notice, and if we fail to meet this need through developing good, rational metaphysics afresh in a new, relatively metaphysical European epoch, they will be all the more likely to shatter the scientific edifice. Schiller's new relativism was to take over this diversionary stabilizing function. For there were signs all around of the end of positive scientism, as a type of thinking which is hostile to metaphysics principle. Thus the trend towards the self-conquest of parliamentary democracy strangely chimes together with the aforesaid self-conquest of materialist or semi-materialist sham and ersatz metaphysics, and with the self-conquest through historical perspectivism of a historical approach which is hostile to metaphysics. Single quote 75 with Schiller Vitalism, which owed its popularity chiefly to the vague discontent with the contemporary state of civilization, to the hardly conscious uneasiness about the existing social situation, was consolidated hierarchically or later through perspectivism. Vitalism itself underwent a relative stabilization without, of course, blunting its attacking edge, which was aimed principally at socialism. Only the mode of battle changed in accordance with bourgeois illusions about relative stabilization. This inner elective affinity of the versatile, adaptable, rather spineless Schiller with the ideological needs of this short transitional period raised him for a while to the authoritative thinker of bourgeois Germany. But Schiller could not strive for and achieve anything more than a compromise. It is a very telling fact that, profoundly steeped as he was in the relativism and irrationalism of the times, he had daydreams of a good and rational metaphysics. These compromising tendencies brought him into close association with the dominant trends of a brief transitional phase. The same forces, however, were very soon to consign his whole philosophy to oblivion. 6. The Ash Wednesday of parasitical subjectivism. Schiller's tempered feelings of uneasiness about the contemporary situation burst into the open in the philosophy of his younger fellow pupil in phenomenology, Martin Heidegger. With the latter, phenomenology came to occupy the center of the German intellectual's philosophical interest for the time being. But it now turned into the ideology of the agony of individualism and the imperialist period. Already the consolidation of Schiller's philosophy echoed only faintly that self-awareness which imperialistic subjectivism had voiced in the philosophy of Dilthey and above all Simmel. It was just extreme relativism which seemed to account for the sovereign assurance of this self-awareness, everything solid resolved into a matter of subjective viewpoint, and all objectivity into a purely relative function or relation conditioned by the subject. This meant that, for all the relativistic resignation, the subject appeared to view itself as creator of the spiritual universe, or at any rate as the power creating, in line with its own model, own assessment and own inner needs, an ordered cosmos out of an otherwise senseless chaos, bestowing on it a meaning to its own greater glory, and appropriating it as the realm of its experiences. Vitalism, even Simmel's, expressed this general feeling more cautiously than did imaginative literature in the imperialist period. The grim years of the First World War, which were full of abrupt changes of fortune, and the ensuing period brought a marked change of mood. The subjectivistic tendency remained, but its basic tenor, its atmosphere was completely altered. No longer was the world a great, multi-purpose stage upon which the eye, in ever-changing costumes and continually transforming the scenery at will, could play out its own inner tragedies and comedies. It had now become a devastated area. Before the war, it had been possible to criticize that which was mechanical and rigid about capitalist culture from a lofty vitalistic angle. This was an innocuous and safe intellectual exercise, for the being of society appeared to stand undisturbed and to guarantee the safe existence of parasitical subjectivism. Since the downfall of the Wilhelmine regime, the social world had started to constitute something alien to this subjectivism. The collapse of that world, which subjectivism was continually criticizing, but which formed the indispensable basis of its existence, was lurking at every door. There was no longer any firm means of support. And in its abandoned condition, the solitary ego stood in fear and anxiety. As a rule, relatively similar social situations produce relatively similar tendencies in thought and feeling. Before the outbreak of the 1848 revolution, which was an international, European event, romantic individualism went to pieces for good. The most important thinker during its crisis and fall, the Dane S0 Ren Kierkegaard, formulated in the most original way the philosophy of the then current romantic individualistic agony. No wonder that now, when this depressed mood was already starting to make itself felt years ahead of the actual crisis, as a foreboding of future gloomy events, a renaissance of Kierkegaard's philosophy was proclaimed by the new phase leading minds. Husserl's pupil Heidegger and the former psychiatrist Karl Jaspers. Of course they did so with up-to-date modifications. Orthodox Protestant religiosity and Kierkegaard's strictly Lutheran faith in the Bible were of no use to present needs. But Kierkegaard's critique of Hegelian philosophy, as a critique of all striving for objectivity and universal validity by reason thought, and of all concepts of historical progress, acquired a very strong contemporary influence. So did Kierkegaard's argumentation of an existential philosophy from the deepest despair of an extreme, self-mortifying subjectivism which sought to justify itself in the very pathos of this despair, in its professed exposure of all ideals of socio-historical life as mere vapid and vain ideas. In contrast to the subject, which alone existed, the altered historical situation did, of course, dictate far-reaching changes. Again, these lay chiefly in the fact that Kierkegaard's philosophy was aimed against the bourgeois idea of progress, against Hegel's idealist dialectics, whereas the renovators of existential philosophy were already principally at odds with Marxism. Although this seldom found overt and direct expression in their writings, at times they attempted to exploit the reactionary aspects of Hegelian philosophy on behalf of this new campaign. That in Kierkegaard existential philosophy was already no more than the ideology of the sadist Philistinism, of fear and trembling, of anxiety, did not stop at conquering wide intellectual circles in Germany on the eve of Hitler's seizure of power and the nihilistic period of so-called heroic realism. On the contrary, this pretentiously tragic Philistinism was precisely the socio-psychological reason for the influence of Heidegger and Jaspers. It was this mood of despair, and not deep-seated programmatic differences, which distinguished existential philosophy from the rest of vitalism. Admittedly, it was more than a matter of chance or merely terminology that the emphatic ally used catchword of life was succeeded by an emphasis on existence. Although the difference was one of mood far more than philosophical method, it nevertheless expressed something new in content and not trivial. The intensity of the loneliness, disappointment and despair created a new content. The emphatic stress on life signified the conquest of the world through subjectivity. Hence the fascist activists of vitalism, who were about to succeed Heidegger and J. Jaspers, revived this catchword, although they gave it a new content once more. Existence as a philosophical leitmotif implied the rejection of a great deal that vitalism had elsewhere approved as alive, and this was now presented as inessential, non-existential. Certainly this mood was not unknown in pre-war vitalism. It is obvious in Nietzsche, although in his case the selection from life, the rebuttal of a portion of life, suggests rather the militant vitalism of fascism and pre-fascism. But Dilthey and Simmel were no strangers to such moods either. Let us remember Simmel's tragedy of culture and his cynically resigned attempts at solving it. And even Dilthey stated once, and the contemporary analysis of human existence fills us all with a feeling of fragility, of the might of the dark impulses, of being afflicted with obscure visions and illusions, of the finiteness in everything that constitutes life, even where these things give rise to the highest constructions of communal life. 76 But it would be wrong to see only a quantitative difference here, a difference of accent. Granted, in order to recognize that the social and psychical motives which existentialism engendered were operative from the start, it is important that we heed the communal foundation, the being of society in the imperialist period. It is equally important, on the other hand, not to overlook what was specifically new about it. We might say that the same motives now appeared in different proportions, thus bringing us closer to that which was new. For the basic philosophical mood of existentialism is expressed in just this qualitative change of proportion. Whereas the earlier vitalism had been mainly concerned with rejecting the moribund formations of social being and confronting them with the vivacity of total subjectivity as organ of the conquest of life, the clef now appeared within the subject. Whereas before, in the context of the aristocratic epistemology, this necessarily entailed, human beings were divided to some extent into two classes, the one living out life and the other torn from it. Now the life of each human being, life in general, was considered at fisk. And the peril was expressed in the very feeling of becoming inessential, of succumbing to the unliving. The emphatic stress on existence instead of life, even in contrast to life, expressed precisely this fear of life's becoming inessential in general, and it indicated a search for that core of genuineness and subjectivity which, it was hoped, man could still endeavor to rescue from the imminent general destruction. So the pathos of the new orientation expressed the yearning to rescue naked existence from a universal collapse, and therein lay this basic mood's affinity with Kierkegaard's. Heidegger united Dilthean tendencies and phenomenology more resolutely and consciously than Schiller. He even brought description and hermeneutics closer together than Dilthey himself had done, and this naturally meant a reinforcement of overt subjectivism. He stated, the methodical meaning of phenomenological description is interpretation. 77 With him even contemplation and thought appear as distant derivative as of understanding. The phenomenological intuition of the essence, too, is based on existential understanding. 78 Despite this heightening of subjectivist tendencies, Heidegger represented perhaps even more strongly than his predecessors the philosophical third way, the claim to be above the antithesis of idealism and materialism. That which is in being is independent of experience, cognition and comprehension, through which it is inferred, discovered, defined. But being is only in the understanding of that which is in being, to whose being belongs something like an understanding of being. 79 This epistemological hocus-pocus, so typical of the whole imperialist period, was carried out by Heidegger such that he always says existence, thus giving the impression of an objectivity independent of human consciousness. Although by existence he meant nothing more than human existence, indeed only, in the final analysis, its manifestation in the consciousness. Heidegger solved this crucial question of the philosophical third way on the basis of a apodictic statement and essential intuition. He himself was obliged to see that through his position, he was approaching that vicious circle which Dilthey had perceived with alarm in the earlier vitalism. But if interpretation must operate within the bounds of the understood and be sustained by it, how then is it to yield scientific results without traveling in a circle, especially if, moreover, the presupposed understanding moves within the general ken of mankind and the world? 80 But whereas Dilthey paused to regard the circle with scientifically honest alarm, Heidegger resolutely cut the knot with the aid of essential intuition. For understanding proves to be the expression of the existential preconstruction of existence itself. Because understanding, in its existential sense, is the potential being of existence, the ontological hypotheses of historical perception surmount, in principle, the rigor of the exact sciences. Mathematics are not stricter than history, but only narrower with regard to the radius of the existential foundations pertaining to mathematics. The special significance of the historical in Heidegger we shall discuss later. Here it is only important to establish that Heidegger ontologically smuggled understanding, that is, a procedure governed purely by consciousness, into objective being and thus tried to create, in his own way, just as ambiguous a contrast between subjectivity and objectivity as Mach, in his own period, had done with regard to the sphere of apprehension. Both, in reality, were carrying out the same transference, though in a different form, befitted their different intentions, of purely subjective idealistic positions into objective ones. It is just that the Maschists were far more open and straightforward in translating direct observations into the only reality accessible to us, whereas Heidegger was presenting the project of a, professedly, special science of pure objectivity, of ontology. To be sure, he was no more successful than the earlier phenomenologists in showing how to find a way from objective reality set in parentheses to genuine objectivity independent of consciousness. On the contrary, he posited a close and organic connection between phenomenology and ontology, allowing the latter to grow out of the former without further ado. Phenomenology is the mode of access to, and the deciding mode of determining that which is to become the theme of ontology. Ontology is only possible as phenomenology. Quote 81 That this had to do with the intuitivistic arbitrariness of essential intuition is indicated by the definition of the object which directly precedes it as, patently that which generally is not immediately manifest, which is concealed in relation to that which generally is immediately manifest, but which at the same time intrinsically belongs to that which generally is immediately manifest, and so to constitute its meaning and ground. This is the very being of that which is in being, the object of ontology. The advance in Heidegger's proposition as against Maschism lies in the fact that he zealously made the difference between essence and phenomenon his central concern, whereas Maschism could only draw overtly subjectivistic distinctions in the phenomenal world. But the advance, which contributed much to Heidegger's influence in a period hankering after objectivity, promptly defeated its own ends in the manner of his answers. For in this method, intuition of the essence alone can decide what is to be comprehended as concealed essence in immediate present reality perceived directly by the subject. Thus with Heidegger too, the objectivity of the ontological materiality remained purely declarative, and the proclamation of ontological objectivity could lead only to a heightening of the pseudo-objectivism and, owing to the intuitivistic selection principle and criterion, irrationality of this sphere of objectiveness. But the terminological camouflaging of subjective idealism was exposed each time that Heidegger came to speak of concrete questions. Let us quote just one example: there is truth only insofar and as long as there is existence. Newton's laws, the thesis of contradiction, every truth in general, these are true only as long as existence is. Before there was any existence and after there is existence no longer, there was and will not be any truth because, as a thing inferred, a discovery and thing discovered, it cannot then be. Quote 82 That is not less subjective idealistic than the view of any follower of Kant or Machiavellianus. This juggling with quasi-objective categories on an extremely subjectivistic basis pervades Heidegger's entire philosophy. He claimed to be arguing an objective doctrine of being, an ontology, but he then defined the ontological essence of the category most central to his world on a purely subjectivistic basis, with pseudo-objectivistic expressions. He said of existence, ontologically, existence is fundamentally different from all that is present and real. Its permanency is grounded not in the substantiality of a substance, but in the autonomy of the existing self whose being was grasped as care. Quote 83 And in another place, that which is in being is always we ourselves. The being of this which is in being is always mine. Quote 84 The arbitrariness examined above in the transition to objectivity is voiced quite plainly in some foregoing methodological remarks. Higher than reality stands possibility. Phenomenological understanding lies solely in seizing it as possibility. For clearly, in any serious attempt to conquer subjectivist irrationalistic arbitrariness scientific ally, only objective reality can produce a standard for genuine or merely imagined possibility. Hegel, therefore, was very right to distinguish sharply between abstract and concrete possibility. Kierkegaard's conscious subjectivism first reversed the philosophical hierarchical positives and placed possibility higher than reality in order to create room, a vacuum, for the free decision of the individual concerned with absolutely nothing beyond saving his soul. Heidegger followed Kierkegaard in this, albeit with a difference which very much impaired the logic and honesty of his philosophizing. For in contrast to his master on this point, he still avowed the objectivity of the categories thus arising. The claim to objectivity is even more marked with Heidegger than with Schiller, and yet he made the subjectivist chair actor of phenomenology far more salient. And the Husserlian tendency towards a strictly scientific approach had now already faded completely. In striving to argue an objective doctrine of being, an ontology, Heidegger needed to draw a sharp dividing line between it and anthropology. But it turns out that when he came to his central problems and was not engaged in pure, detached methodology, his ontology is in actual fact merely a vitalistic anthropology with an objectivistic mask. So here again Heidegger was faced with an insoluble dilemma of the kind we have noted with Dilthey. And here again the same contrast between the two holds good. Dilthey shrank from the dilemma and tried to evade it, whereas Heidegger cut the knot in a loftily declarative, overtly irrationalistic manner. Characteristic, for example, are his efforts to prove the underlying anthropological bias in Kant's transcendental logic, efforts intended to make Kant just as much a forerunner of existential philosophy as Simmel had made him out to be a forerunner of vitalism. Over and above his reading of Kant, however, Heidegger expressed this tendency at every point. Anthropology today, in Heidegger's view, is not a special discipline, but the word signifies a basic tendency of man's present attitude to himself and to the whole of that which is in being. In accordance with this basic attitude, something is only perceived and understood if it has found an anthropological explanation. Anthropology not only seeks the truth about man, but now lays claim to decide what truth can signify in general. 85 And he clarified this attitude, which implied a factual identity between his ontology and anthropology, by saying that no age had known as much about man as the present one, it was also true that no age knew less what man is than the present age. To no age has man become so questionable as to ours. This plainly expresses the negativity of Heidegger's philosophical tendencies. For him, philosophy was no longer the detached strict science of Husserl, but also no longer the path to a concrete world outlook, as vitalism from Dilthey to Spengler and Scheler had been. Its task was rather to keep the investigation open by means of questions. 86. With a pathos reminiscent of Kierkegaard, Heidegger expounded his position as follows: does it make sense, and are we entitled to comprehend man as creative and hence as infinite on the basis of his intrinsic finiteness, the fact that he needs ontology, that is, understanding of being when it is just the idea of infinite essence that rebuffs nothing so radically as an ontology? Or have we already become all too much the dupes of organization, industry and speed for it to be possible for us to be familiar with the essential, simple and permanent? 87. Thus what Heidegger termed phenomenology and ontology was in reality no more than an abstractly mythicizing, anthropological description of human existence. In his concrete phenomenological descriptions, however, it unexpectedly turned into an, often grippingly interesting, description of intellectual Philistinism during the crisis of the imperialist period. Heidegger himself admitted this to a certain degree. His program was to show that which is in being is it immediately and mostly is, in its average everyday state. 88. Now what is really interesting about Heidegger's philosophizing is the extremely detailed account of how the human being, the supporting subject of existence, immediately and for the most part dissipates and loses himself in this everyday state. Here reasons of space, apart from anything else, prevent us from retailing this account. Let us stress just one element, namely that the unauthenticity of the Heideggerian everyday existence, that which he calls the fallen state, is caused by social being. According to Heidegger, man's social character is an existential of existence, which he regards as a term in the sphere of existence equivalent to categories in thinking. Now, social existence signifies the anonymous dominance of the one. We need to quote at some length from this account in order that the reader can receive a concrete picture of Heidegger's ontology of the everyday state. The who is not this person or that person, not oneself and not several and not the sum of all. The who is the neutral, the one. It is by being inconspicuous and incapable of being pinned down that the one evolves his actual dictatorship. We enjoy and amuse ourselves in the way one enjoys himself. We read, view and judge literature and art in the way one looks and judges. But we also withdraw from the great mass of people in the way one withdraws. We find outrageous whatever one finds outrageous. The one, which is no specific person and all persons, although not the sum of them, dictates the type of being of the everyday state. Each is the other and nobody is he himself. The one, the answer to the question as to the who of everyday existence, is a nobody to which all existence in the being among one another has already delivered itself up. In the ontological characteristics of everyday being among one another on display, stallness, mediocrity, leveling, public life, shedding of being and acquiescence lies the nearest permanence of existence. One is in the mode of non-independence and unauthenticity. This mode of being does not signify any reduction in the facticity of existence, any more than the one as nobody is a cipher. On the contrary, existence is, in this ontological type, an ens realissimum, provided that reality is understood as being governed by existence. To be sure, the one is as little present as is existence in general. The more obviously the one behaves, the more incomprehensible and latent it is, but it is also all the less of a not. To unprejudiced ontological vision, it will reveal itself as the most real subject of the everyday state. 89. Such descriptions constitute the strongest and most suggestive part of being and time, and in all likelihood they form the basis of the book's broad and profound effect. Here, with the tools of phenomenology, Heidegger was giving a series of interesting images taken from the inner life, from the world view of the dissolute bourgeois mind of the post-war years. These images are suggestive because they provide, on the descriptive level, a genuine and true-to-life picture of those conscious reflexes which the reality of post-war imperialist capitalism triggered off in those unable or unwilling to surpass what they experienced in their individual existence and to go further towards objectivity, that is, towards exploring the socio-historical causes of their experiences. With these tendencies, Heidegger was not alone in his time. Similar tendencies were expressed not only in Jaspers's philosophy, but also in a large part of the imaginative literature of the period. It will suffice, perhaps, to mention Céline's novel, Journey to the End of the Night, and Joyce, Gide, Malraux, etc. However, even if we acknowledge the partial accuracy of these accounts of spiritual states, we must ask how far they square with objective reality, how far their descriptions go beyond the immediacy of the reacting subjects. Of course, this question is chiefly a philosophical moment. Imaginative literature operates within far more elastic limits, although its stature is still determined by the comprehensive concreteness and depth of the representation of reality. But to treat the problems arising from this is not within the scope of these studies. Heidegger's descriptions are related to the spiritual conditions prompted by the crisis of post-war imperialistic capitalism. There is evidence for this not only in the influence exercised by being and time, far beyond the sphere of the really philosophically minded, it was repeatedly singled out for praise and censure by philosophical critics. What Heidegger was describing was the subjective bourgeois, intellectual reverse side of the economic categories of capitalism, in the form, of course, of a radically idealistic subjectifying and hence a distortion. In this respect, Heidegger was carrying on Semmel's tendency to construct a basement underneath historical materialism, professedly in order to render visible the philosophical, indeed metaphysical hypotheses of this doctrine. The difference, however, tells us more than the affinity. It is a difference expressed in both the methodology and the mood of Heidegger's work. Methodologically, in the fact that, in contrast to Simmel, who was expressly criticizing historical materialism and trying to deepen it through personal reinterpretation, Heidegger did not give the least indication of doing anything similar. Not only is the name of Marx absent from being and time, even from allusions where it is patently relevant, the content also dispenses with all objective categories of economic reality. Heidegger's method was more radically subjectivistic, without exception his descriptions pertain to spiritual reflexes to socio-economic reality. Here we have manifested in practice the inner identity of phenomenology and ontology, the purely subjective character of even the latter in spite of all declared objectivity. Indeed, it is even manifest that this shift to ontology, an allegedly objective ontology, rendered the philosophical view of the world still more subjectivistic than it was at the time of the overtly radical subjectivism of a thinker like Simmel. For in the latter, there are at least glimmers of objective social reality with its contours distorted, whereas in Heidegger this reality is reduced to purely a series of spiritual states described phenomenologically. This shift of method is intimately connected with the change in the basic mood. Simmel was philosophizing in the very helpful early days of Vitalism. Despite establishing a tragedy of culture, and for all his critique of capitalist civilization, he still considered money, as we may recall, the guardian of inwardness. In Heidegger, these illusions had crumbled long ago. The individual's inner life had long since renounced all world-conquering plans. No longer was its social environment regarded as something problematical in itself, but in whose domain pure inwardness could nonetheless lead a free life. The surrounding world was now an uncanny, mysterious permanent threat to everything that would constitute the essence of subjectivity. This again, to be sure, was not a new experience for bourgeois man under capitalism. Ibsen, for example, had portrayed it many decades earlier in the famous scene where his peer Gein symbolizing the problem of the essentiality, or lack of it, in his own life, peels an onion and finds no core. Only peel. In Heidegger this expression of the aging and despairing peer Gein became the determining maxim of his descriptions. This is the meaning of the dominance of the one, but the understanding of existence in the one perpetually overlooks itself. In its projects, in respect of the genuine ontological possibilities, 9 degrees for Heidegger, this was something akin to an ontological proof for anti-democratism. And he amplified this idea in a graphic concept: existence hurtles out of the himself into the itself, into the bottomlessness and nothingness of the unauthentic everyday state. It is just this which is concealed through public life and is manifested as concrete life. But this is a deceptive whirlpool. This continual breaking loose from authenticity while always simulating it, at one with the process of tearing into the one. Accordingly, the average everyday state of existence may be defined as a falsifying, disclosed, dejected projecting state of being in the world, concerned with its intrinsic ontological potential in its being with the world and in its co-being with others. Single quote 91. This makes it clear that with Heidegger, the transition from phenomenology to ontology was, at root, as much directed against the socialist perspective on social development as the irrationalistic method of all leading bourgeois thinkers since Nietzsche. Germany's post-war crisis and the class struggles exacerbated as a result of it, with, in the background, the existence and growing strength of the socialist Soviet Union and, among both the working class and intelligentsia, the spread of a Marxism taken a stage higher by Lenin, impelled all men into making a personal choice far more strongly than was the case in quieter times. Heidegger, as we have noted, did not explicitly contest the economic doctrines of Marxism-Leninism or the political consequences they entailed. Neither he nor the caste he represented was capable of it. He attempted rather to avoid the necessity of drawing social conclusions by ontologically branding all man's public activity as unauthentic. Bourgeois man's sense of becoming an essential, indeed a non-entity, was a universal experience among the intelligentsia of this period. Hence Heidegger's complicated trains of thought, his laborious phenomenological introspections struck upon the material of experiences widespread among this class and found an answering chord. Heidegger was here preaching a retreat from all social dealings just as much as Schopenhauer, in his time, had proclaimed a withdrawal from the bourgeois idea of progress, from the democratic revolution. Heidegger's retreat, however, implies a reactionary stand far stronger than that to be found in Schopenhauer's quietism. At the height of the revolution, to be sure, even this quietism could, within the thinker advocating it, all too easily tilt over into counter-revolutionary activity, and Nietzsche demonstrated how easily a counter-revolutionary activism could be evolved from Schopenhauer's hypotheses on the philosophical level as well. One may say without undue exaggeration that in the period of the imperialistic bourgeoisie's struggle against socialism, Heidegger was related to Hitler and Rosenberg as Schopenhauer, in his own day, was related to Nietzsche. All the same, events never repeat themselves mechanically. Not even in the history of philosophy. The human emotional emphasis in the withdrawing process was totally different, indeed opposed, in Schopenhauer and Heidegger. With the latter, the feeling of despair no longer left the individual free scope for a beatific, aesthetic and religious contemplation as in Schopenhauer. His sense of peril already encompassed the whole realm of individual existence. And although the solipsism of the phenomenological method may have distorted the depiction of it, it was still a social fact, the inner state of the bourgeois individual within the crumbling monopoly capitalism, facing the prospect of its downfall. Thus Heidegger's despair had two facets: on the one hand, the remorseless bearing of the individual's inner nothingness in the imperialistic crisis. On the other, and because the social grounds for this nothingness were being fetishistically transformed into something timeless and antisocial, the feeling to which it gave rise could very easily turn into a desperate revolutionary activity. It is certainly no accident that Hitler's propaganda continually appealed to despair. Among the working masses, admittedly, the despair was occasioned by their socio-economic situation. Among the intelligentsia, however, that mood of nihilism and despair from whose subjective truth Heidegger proceeded, which he conceptualized, clarified philosophically and canonized as authentic, created a basis favorable to the efficacy of Hitlerian agitation. This everyday state of being, dominated by the one, was therefore actually a non-being. And in fact Heidegger defined being not as immediately given, but as extremely remote. The state of being in which each of us rests is ontologically the remotest state. 92 This most intrinsic part of man, he maintained, was forgotten and buried in everyday life. And it was precisely the task of ontology to rescue it from oblivion. This programmatic attitude to life determined Heidegger's whole method. We have already indicated, more than once, the unsurmountable subjectivism of the phenomenology, the pseudo-objectivity of the ontology. But only now that Heidegger's world picture stands before us in a certain concreteness with regard to both content and structure is it plain that this method, for all its objective fragility, was the only possible one for his purposes. For in Heidegger's conception, man's life in society was a matter not of a relation between subjectivity and objectivity, not of a reciprocal relationship between subject and object, but of authenticity and unauthenticity within the same subject. Only in appearance, in the methodological expressions, did the ontological surpassing of objective reality set in parentheses tend towards objectivity. In actual fact it was turning to another, purportedly deeper, layer of subjectivity. Indeed it may be said that with Heidegger, a category expressed being all the more genuinely and came all the closer to being the less it was encumbered by the conditions of objective reality. For that reason his defining terms were without exception of a decidedly subjective character. But for that very reason, Heidegger's ontology was bound to grow more irrationalistic the more it developed its true nature. Admittedly, Heidegger was constantly trying to shut himself off from irrationalism. Here too it was his aim to elevate himself above the antithesis of rationalism and irrationalism, to find a philosophical third road, just as in the question of idealism and materialism. But for him it was impossible. He repeatedly criticized the limits of rationalism, but would then add to his critique, no slighter matter, therefore, is that falsification of phenomena which banishes him to the refuge of the irrational. Irrationalism, as the counterpart of rationalism, speaks only squintingly of that to which the latter is blind. 93 But since, in Heidegger's eyes, this blindness lies in the fact that rationalism takes into account the observable facts and laws of objective reality, a loss of all real possibility results from his exclusion of irrationalism. For if one removes from a concrete state every condition relevant to observable reality, if this concrete state arises solely in the inner life, it is inevitable that the consequent findings will take on an irrationalistic character. This was already so with Kierkegaard. The latter, however, although able to work with theological categories and hence to attain a quasi-rationality or quasi-dialectic, did not shrink from the most extreme conclusions and spoke, with regard to precisely the decisive questions of existence, of the paradox, that is, of irrationality. Heidegger lacked, on the one hand, the possibility of resorting to overtly theological categories, and, on the other, the courage openly to declare his allegiance to irrationalism. Yet every one of his ontological statements shows that the deification of all conditions of objectivity and reality, however we may phrase this, leads to irrationalism. Let us give a single example. Heidegger writes of mood. This is realized in principle in its why, whence and whither. This ontological character of existence which is shrouded in its whence and whither, but which is all the more openly revealed to existence itself, this that it is, we call the thrownness of this state of being in its there. And this means that it constitutes other qua being in the world. But the resulting facticity is not the matter-of-factness of the factum brutum of something which is present, but an ontological character of existence which, although at first forced away, has been taken up into existence. 94 As long as being, in Heidegger's project, intervenes or intends to intervene, the findings and the road to obtaining them can only be irrationalistic. The road to being means a casting aside of all objective conditions of reality. At all times, Heidegger's ontology imperiously demanded this in order that man might escape the power of the one that rendered him unauthentic and took away his essence. We thus see that, inadvertently, Heidegger's ontology was turning into a moral doctrine, indeed almost a religious sermon. This ethico-religious epistemological shift also shows the determining influence of Kierkegaard on Heidegger's propositions and method. The gist of the sermon is that man should become essential and make ready to hear and understand the call of conscience in order to mature to resolution. Heidegger gave a very detailed account of this process too. Again, we can give only a brief outline of it here. The disclosure of the nothingness concealed in the fallen state is achieved through ontology. The essence of the originally nullifying nothing lies herein. It begins by putting being there before the state of being as such. Being there means bound immanency in nothingness. 95 That is the essence of Heidegger's existence, and men were deemed to differ merely in respect of whether or not they were conscious of it. The attainment of awareness took place through the conscience. Conscience is a call of anxiety from the uncannoness of being in the world, summoning existence to its most intimate potential state of guiltiness. Understanding of the summons initiates personal existence into the uncannoness of its isolation. 96 The understanding of this summons brought men to a state of resolution. Heidegger stressed the significance of this existential with great pathos. After what has gone before, it comes as no surprise when he strongly denies that resolution in respect of man's surroundings might bring about even the slightest change. Not even the dominance of the one is disturbed. The world close at hand does not become another in substance, and the circle of the other ones remains unchanged. The irresolution of the one still holds sway, only it is incapable of combating resolute existence. Single quote 97. Here, the methodology and content of Heidegger's philosophy are expressing in an extremely complicated terminology the intellectual Philistine's feelings in a time of severe crisis. The threat to personal existence is so deflected as to prevent its giving rise to any obligation to alter one's external living conditions or indeed to collaborate in transforming objective social reality. Difficult though Heidegger may be to grasp, this much was correctly read out of his philosophy. So the only result arrived at here was the insight that existence as such is to blame, and the authentic life of the resolute man now constituted a preparation for death, a foreshadowing of the possibility, in Heidegger's terminology. Here again there are traces of Kierkegaard, though without his pronounced Protestant theology. Like every vitalistic philosophy, this Heideggerian theology without positive religion or a personal God was, of course, besought to contain a new doctrine of time of its own. This too was a methodological necessity. For the rigid opposition of space and time was one of the weakest points of undialectical rationalism. But whereas a true way of surmounting that opposition must lie in the dialectical interaction of space and time founded in objective reality, irrational vitalism had always directed its sharpest attacks against the rationalistic time concept, taking time and space, like culture and civilization in the realm of social philosophy, as diametrically opposed, indeed warring principles. To conquer time was very important to vitalism in a positive respect. This is the reverse side of the aforesaid polemical intention, because the identification of experience and life crucial to its pseudo-objectivism was only possible if there was a subjectified, irrationalistic conception of time to meet this demand. Heidegger laid much weight on this. He sharply divorced himself from Bergson, whom he condemned, along with Aristoteles and Hegel, as representing the vulgar view of time. This vulgar time was the accepted one that knows past, present and future, the time of the fallen world of the one, the time of measurement, clock time, etc. Genuine time, on the contrary, knew no sequentiality. The future is not later than that which has come to pass, and the latter not earlier than the present. Temporaneity proceeds futurity which has come to pass and is bringing to pass. Single quote 98. Epistemologically, the contrast to Bergson was merely a difference of nuance. For each of them, Bergson and Heidegger posited a subjectively experienced time as authentic time in opposition to real objective time. Only, in the case of Bergson, who in the essence of his epistemology was a pre-war figure whose thought shows many affinities with Simmel and with pragmatism, experienced time was an organon of the subjective individualistic conquest of the world. In Heidegger's diseased philosophy, however, real time is desecularized and becomes devoid of content, theological, concentrated purely on the element of personal decision. Hence Bergson aimed his sallies chiefly against spatial time, against concepts formed in the exact sciences, and his real time was oriented to aesthetic experience, whereas with Heidegger, vulgar time corresponds to an existence that has fallen foul of the one, and real time points towards death. Here again it can be easily spotted that the difference between Heidegger's and Bergson's view of time was of a social character and determined by their respective adversaries. In essence, Bergson was polemicizing against scientific materialistic worldview obtaining during the rise of the bourgeoisie. Heidegger, even with regard to the theory of time and the reading of historicity closely associated with it, was chiefly attacking the new adversary, the historical materialism whose influence was being felt in all areas of life. In both cases, however, this antithesis within the concept of time was a means to setting up an irrationalistic philosophy. Granted, Heidegger did discover that time played a hitherto unobserved role in Kant's critique of pure reason, above all in the chapter on schemata or essential forms. The central position of time, Heidegger stated, thus disrupts the dominion of reason and understanding. Logic has lost its long-standing primacy in metaphysics. Its idea is becoming questionable. Single quote 99. Thus Kant becomes, for Heidegger, one of the fathers of modern irrationalism. In view of this interpretation of time, Heidegger's second chief programmatic point, proof of the elementary historicality of existence as the basis for comprehending history, turns out to be pure shadow boxing. Heidegger was right in making a stand against the neo-Kantians who were trying to argue historicality from a subjective setting, and in indicating that being must be historical in order for there to be any historical science. As on many points, vitalism was here preempting the collapse of undialectic idealism. But Heidegger still lagged far behind the neo-Kantians in the concrete definition of his existential historicality. As a consequence, the primary phenomenon of history was, for him, existence, that is, the life of the individual, the universal coherence of life between birth and death. And this too, quite in accordance with the Diltheian vitalistic method, was defined from experience. It consists of a sequence of experiences within time. The result was a double distortion. Firstly, Heidegger did not take the historical data in nature as the originals, but presented the coherence of human experiences far removed from the original state as a starting point, the primal phenomenon. Secondly, he failed to observe that his prima phenomenon was derivative, a consequence of that social being and praxis of men in which alone such a coherence of experiences could come about at all. As far as he did notice a link, he rejected it as belonging to the domain of the one. In so doing, he not only isolated a distorted derivative of human social praxis, as a historical primal phenomenon, as original, from real history, but also set them up as antinomies. The tendency to falsify in this way the structure of reality graphically expresses the pre-fascist character of Heidegger's thinking. Now, since the primary historicality was ontologically founded on this basis, the automatic product of it was Heidegger's crucial distinction between authentic and unauthentic history. In keeping with the rooting of historicality and anxiety, existence exists as authentically historical or unauthentically historical, all depending. But according to Heidegger's reading of history, it was precisely real history which is unauthentic, just as real time is the vulgar kind. In giving history an apparently ontologically reasoned basis, Heidegger actually took away any kind of historicality, whilst acknowledging as historical only a Philistine's moral resolution. In his analysis of everyday existence, Heidegger had already rejected all human orientation towards objective facts or trends in socio-historical life. There he stated, "One would completely mistake phenomenally what mood reveals and how it does so, were one aiming at collating with the revealed material that which existence, in the given mood, knows about and believes. Simultaneously, even if existence is secure in the belief of its whither, or thinks it is rationally enlightened about the whence, none of this affects the established phenomenal fact that the mood confronts existence with that of its there, a remorselessly sphinx-like sight. Existently ontologically, one has not the least right to suppress the evidence of the existing state through judging by the apodictic certainty of a theoretical perception of that which is purely present." 102. The illumination of existence can come only from within, for every objectively directed perception brings about a casting down, a state of surrender to the one and unauthenticity. Thus it was only logical for Heidegger, in positing the historicality of existence, to refute equally firmly everything objectively historical. Heidegger's historicality, then, has nothing to do with the point that existence occurs in a world history. 103. Here he was polemicizing, quite rightly to some extent, against the old idealistic argumentation of the theory of history. The location of the historical problem, he said, must not be sought in history as a science of history. How history may become a possible object of history can only be inferred from the ontological character of the historical, from historicality and its rootedness and temporaneity. 104. Here again Heidegger was preempting the collapse of idealism, not unskillfully, by giving the impression that he planned to make the historical nature of existence itself the starting point of history. But in one breath he was giving this existence itself, as we have observed, a thoroughly subjectivistic definition, while in the next he radically purged the original historicality of existence of all relation to real, objective history. 4. In accordance with the rooting of history and anxiety, existence exists as either authentically or unauthentically historical. 105. From this we may logically conclude that the authentic being into death, that is, the finiteness of temporaneity is a latent ground of the historicality of existence. 106. This, of course, implies the positing of an unauthentic historicality as well. And here, in accordance with the main substance of his conception, Heidegger almost compromised himself. For if the sole historical issue at stake is that of what one might, in theological language, term saving the soul, then there is no clear reason why everything else, whose role cannot be more than, at most, a distraction from being in history, should likewise have a historical character. But sometimes Heidegger acknowledged a primary and secondary, and sometimes an authentic and unauthentic historicality. Implement and work. Institutions have their history, but nature too is historical. Granted, that is not the case precisely as long as we are speaking of natural history. It may be so, on the contrary, as landscape, scene of human settlement and exploitation, as battlefield and shrine. 107. So not much more emerges from Heidegger's an authentic history than a Spinglerian historicality. But whereas, with Spengler, this was an organic part of his conception, with Heidegger it damaged the basic idea and was, in the last analysis, unnecessary ballast. In part it arose from Heidegger's reluctance openly to conform to radical irrationalism, to the radical rejection of any scientific approach. And in part it was a legacy, no longer organic, of the basic theological conception of Heidegger's path to saving the soul, a path which in Heidegger, godless and soulless, had lost its earlier guiding principles. This brings to light an important factor in Heidegger's relationship to Kierkegaard. For Heidegger arrived at this twofold view of history as authentic and unauthentic under the influence of Kierkegaard's polemics against Hegel. But as always in history, the reactionary thinker at the less advanced stage was more candid, forthright and rigorous than his imperialistic epigony. Kierkegaard acknowledged no world history save in the eyes of God. For man, who in his view, significantly enough, could be only a spectator in history, there is no history but only an individual moral cum religious development. Kierkegaard stated, for the ethical sphere, world historical immanence is always confessing, and yet world historical contemplation lies precisely in immanence. When an individual beholds something ethical, it is the ethical element within him that he sees. For it would not be correct to conclude, the more ethically advanced a man is, the more he will see the ethical element in world history. No, the very opposite is true. The more a man progresses ethically, the less concerned he will be with the world historical sphere. Let me use a metaphor to convey more graphically the difference between the ethical and world historical spheres, the individual's ethical relation to God and the relation of the world historical to God. There may be a time when a king has a royal theater all to himself, but this exclusion of his subjects is fortuitous. It is a different matter when we speak of God and the royal theater which he has to himself. So the individual's ethical development is a small private theater where God is the spectator, but occasionally also individual man himself, although he should be essentially the actor, viz. An actor who does not dissemble, but bears himself, just as all ethical development is a process of exposure to the sight of God. World history, on the contrary, is a royal theater for God, where he is the sole spectator not by accident but essentially so, because he alone can be. An existing spirit has no access to this theater. If he then supposes himself a spectator, he is simply forgetting that he himself is meant to be an actor in the little theater, leaving it to his royal spectator and dramatist to decide how to employ him in the royal drama, the drama dramatum. 108. This forcefully expresses the backlash against Germany's classical literature and philosophy. Whereas for Goethe, the fulfillment of and solution to his Faust's truest ethical problems was possible only in the wide world of part 2 of his play, Kierkegaard restricted ethics to the little world of the first part. And whereas Hegelian ethics cal single quote SED into world history, Kierkegaard excluded just this in principle from men's existential activity. Admittedly, with Kierkegaard, often occurred in this period, vitalism was linked with unresolved questions of bourgeois idealistic dialectics. It was only the weakness of the Hegelian philosophy of history, which ended by contemplating the total course of events to date, that made the Kierkegaardian proposition possible, in that Kierkegaard could pour scorn on this contemplation as being an abstract, professorial, inadequate and indeed humiliating attitude to take towards the important questions of human life, and could counter it with at least the semblance of a praxis. This Kierkegaardian praxis was an ironic revenge on Hegel because the latter, unable to think historical praxis through to its logical end, stopped at the present and let it turn into contemplation. But in its real essence, Kierkegaard's praxis had nothing to do with the sole really historical praxis. Indeed, the fact that Kierkegaard, as we have noted, vehemently disavowed it implied the possibility of reviving, with a certain limited consistency, the old duality of theological thinking about history. In this, too, the individual soul's path to salvation was the authentic content of history. But the old theology, especially Catholic theology, was capable of incorporating the individual paths to salvation in a theological history of the cosmos and mankind, and thus of still arriving, within its own terms of reference, as with Bossuet, at a unified view of history. As we have seen, the soul's path to salvation as the content of history was also the basis of Kierkegaard's view of history. But for Kierkegaard, each man seeking his existence and the saving of his soul had to enter into a direct relationship to Christ, as source of salvation, a relationship that he could realize only from within. And here, in the sphere of authentic existence, all historicality is abolished, so that history itself becomes wholly transcendent, only in the recognition that before Christ's appearance, men had a fundamentally different attitude to their own existence. Are there still traces of a theological historicality? But even here, in the last analysis, two types of existential behavior confront one another, whereby each type in and for itself lacks history, and the historicality is defined simply by Christ's appearance, which separates periods and types. It was only possible for Kierkegaard to take his aforesaid ironic revenge on Hegel because, despite the latter's energetic efforts, successful in part, to interpret history purely as the product of human praxis, the salient points of his philosophy of history disappeared in the mists of an idealistic theology. And this gave rise to a contemplation of history at once godlike and ex cathedra instead of a theoretical study, which was merely a summing up of the experiences of praxis so far on behalf of a better, more conscious praxis to come. With regard to this contemplation, Kierkegaard's critique had a certain qualified justification. But only, to sure, qua criticism, for as soon as his critique becomes concrete it turns, in contrast to rational Hegelian theology, which rises to the conceptual heights, into an irrational theology. And it loses its relative justification when Hegel's historicism gives way to the irrationalist's open denial of history. In Heidegger we find a problem, complex similar to that found in Kierkegaard, but lacking a god, Christ or a soul. Heidegger wanted to create a theological philosophy of history on behalf of religious atheism. Hence the disappearance of all the substantial elements of theology, even Kierkegaard's, with only the now totally empty theological framework remaining. For Kierkegaard too, such categories of the forlorn life of isolated individuality as anxiety, care, guilt feelings, resolution, etc., were the existentials of authentic reality. But Kierkegaard, because of the residue of a theological philosophy of history positing, to his mind, a real history for God, was capable of radically denying historicality for the individual man working out his own salvation. Heidegger, on the other hand, had to disguise this unhistorical existence as authentic history in order to achieve a contrast to the denial of real history. Again, the socio-historical content was the deciding factor in this antithesis. Kierkegaard, whose thinking rejected bourgeois democratic progress, could still envisage a way back into the feudal religious world, even if, as we have shown, this conception was already susceptible in his work to a decadent, bourgeois dissolution. Heidegger, who wrote during the crisis of monopoly capitalism and in the virginity of a socialist state ever gaining in strength and appeal, could evade the consequences of the crisis period only by disparaging real history as unauthentic. This also meant acknowledging as authentic history only such a spiritual development as would, through care, despair and so forth, lead men away from social actions and decisions, at the same time confirming them inwardly in such a state of disorientation and perplexity as would encourage to the utmost a switch to reactionary activism of the Hitlerian variety. So the whole pretentious point of Heidegger's philosophy of time and history does not go beyond his ontology of everyday life. For its content is still merely the inner life of the modern Philistine frightened to death by nothingness, a non-entity in himself, and gradually becoming aware of his nothingness. After this analysis of Heidegger's existential philosophy we can discuss that of Jasper's far more briefly. For in both cases, both the point of departure and the conclusions are remarkably similar. That J. Jaspers was openly writing as a psychologist is instructive inasmuch as this, in connection with the development of phenomenology in Schiller and Heidegger, and with the growing influence of Dilthey's descriptive psychology, completes the exposure of their original pseudo-objectivity. Jaspers's first influential philosophical work, Psychology of World Outlooks, was an attempt to fulfill the Diltheyan program for a topology of philosophies. In this book, to be sure, J. Jaspers had already completely renounced Dilthey's dream that topology might point the way to an objective philosophical worldview. He sought precisely the opposite. Under the influence of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, whom J. Jaspers regarded as the philosophers of the day, and also under the influence of Max Weber's sociological relativism, this topology was meant to proclaim the total rejection of the very possibility and value of an objectively philosophical knowledge. In this respect, Jaspers took radical vitalistic relativism farther than any of his predecessors. For everything objective about knowledge he used the scornfully ironic term shall, thereby restating the old vitalistic antithesis of the alive and the moribund, though with the special nuance that here, it is avowedly all objectivity which appears as moribund and extinct. Jaspers wrote of this question, every doctrine formulated of the whole becomes a shell devoid of the original experiencing of the ultimate situations, and it thwarts those energies which are actively seeking the meaning of future existence in self-willed experience. For this it substitutes the calm of a fully perceived and perfected, soul-appeasing world of eternally present meaning. Single quote 109. If we just recall Simul's statements, extensively quoted earlier, on the relation of the soul to the objective spirit, and on the fairly relativistically conceived tragedy of culture, we can see how far vitalism has proceeded towards relativistic nihilism in the meantime. Jaspers regarded every shell not only as fateful for life in general or for individual men's development, the only development that mattered to him, but also as a social threat. With the assertion of the one truth as universally valid for all men, falsehood immediately sets in. 1.10 That is taking a Kierkegaardian line. The statement proceeds from the supposition that all universal, commonly binding objective truth is necessarily opposed to the inner subjective veracity and sincerity of the individual, that the two are hostile and mutually exclusive. Anti-scientific thinking thereby acquires an ethico-metaphysical slant. And with Jaspers, as with his exemplars, this slant has an anti-democratic character. Jaspers saw the powers of objectivity that threatened subjective truth as residing almost exclusively where a democratic rule by the masses was springing up. Hence fanaticism and brute force were, for him, the salient necessary consequences of such a falsehood, born of the world's belief in the truths of the shells. Already in Heidegger, we find a plainly anti-democratic tendency. The mythical, phenomenological figure of the one is a distilled caricature of that anonymity and lack of responsibility which reactionary propaganda has always taken as the chief characteristic of any democracy. In Jaspers, this tendency amounted to the most extreme Philistinism. Only with the inwardly turned, purely self-reliant individuum could, J. Jaspers believed, truth, integrity and humanity be found. And, in true German petty bourgeois style, he represented all mass influence as falseness and barbarity. This radical subjectivism manifested in the doctrine of the shell is what is specific to Jaspers's philosophy. Any knowledge of the objective world had, accordingly, only a technical use, and only the illumination of existence had a real significance that touched on being. Jaspers expressed himself as follows on this central point of his thinking. Existential philosophy would be lost at once if it believed it knew again what man is. It would again provide the basic outlines for an investigation of human and animal life in its types, and would revert to being anthropology, psychology, sociology. It can have meaning only if it remains without a base in its concreteness. It awakens that which it does not know. It illuminates and activates, but it does not pin down. Because it remains without a concrete object, illumination of existence does not yield any results. The clarity of awareness contains a demand without fulfilling it. As observers we must be content with that. For I am not that which I perceive, and I do not perceive what I am. Instead of observing my existence I can only set in motion the process of clarified awareness. 1. This position gave rise, in J. Jaspers, to a Kierkegaardian bias which is in many ways linked with Heidegger's, seeing something real only in inwardness, in one's own soul, in the existence-preserving stance of the totally isolated individual. Heidegger, however, elaborated this standpoint with a certain abstract rigor, and only where he planned to reveal the historicality of existence on this basis did his sorry Philistinism become fully apparent. J. Jaspers planned to set out a broad, substantial and finished concrete philosophy, cultural critique, etc., on the basis of his Kierkegaardian solipsism. Hence his petty bourgeois, intellectual cant, a vain and Philistine self-indulgence, became much more quickly apparent. Jaspers even demanded something that seems absurd in the light of his hypotheses, political action. He condemned both apolitical conduct and blind political volition. Now this gave rise to the following petty bourgeois ideal: only patience in the long term coupled with secret resolution as regards a sudden intervention, comprehensive knowledge which stays open to the infinite realm of possibility beyond urgently real matters, can perform something here which is more than mere tumult, destruction, driving things away. Single quote 112 This demand looks all the more comical in that Jaspers logically rejected any forecast or foresight. The knowledge of the run of things which considers them with foresight remains a knowledge of possibilities among which that which will really come true does not even have to occur. Single quote 1:13. So, after all these fruitless excursions into the world of reality, it is only the Kierkegaardian perspective that retains its validity, since the course of the world is unfathomable, since up to now the best has failed and may fall short again, and since, therefore, the course of the world in the long run is not at all the one and only issue, all plans and actions with an eye to the distant future are curtailed so as to create an animate existence here and now. To do genuine deeds in the present is, in the last resort, the only thing which assuredly remains for me. 1:14. This final dictum, which is closely related to Heidegger's teaching, gives rise to a somewhat amusing contradiction in Jaspers. He saw in the contemporary, wholly self-reliant human being a step forward. Really, therefore, he should have been obliged to affirm the present age that had produced this human being and this one genuine philosophical proposition, as did the more logical Simmel with regard to his subjectivism. But since Jaspers harbored a deadly hate of the masses and a quivering fear of them, democracy and socialism, a romantic glorification of earlier ages emerged hand in glove with his polemics against the shell. Thus, for example, he occasionally defended the church as the existential precondition for the freedom evolving at any given time, 1:15, completely forgetting that vitalism and imperialist Germany. 5:2:1. According to his theory, every church would necessarily constitute a shell. Here again we see the superiority of the class authors of philosophical reaction over their epigonies. From the standpoint of his existential Protestantism, Kierkegaard had constantly raised the most passionate objections to the church. This contradiction renders Jaspers's would-be sublime gesture comical, compromising and trivial. Time and again nihilism was converted into a petty bourgeois Calvinistic, modernized inner-worldly ascesis, giving rise to a vitalistic caricature of Max Weber's relativistic sociology. Heidegger went only so far as to elaborate the existential. Jaspers, on the other hand, published a massive 3-volume philosophical system under the title, at once proud and modest, of philosophy. In the introductory studies, the matter indicated here is expounded on a broad scale. Only in the third part does there occur a cryptology whereby the impossibility of perceiving reality objectively was to be read afresh as a positive form of world comprehension. Jaspers wanted, on the one hand, after the model of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche to maintain the pose of an undaunted hammer of objectivity, while, on the other, he had neither Kierkegaard's faith in pristine Christianity nor Nietzsche's vision of an imperialistic epoch to come. And yet, instead of logically drawing the nihilistic conclusions, he aimed at conjuring something loosely positive out of Heidegger's murderous nothingness. Herein lies his half-heartedness compared to Heidegger's radical nihilism. Thus Jaspers's philosophy, like Heidegger's, bore no philosophical fruit whatever, but still had uncommonly far-reaching consequences for society. Heidegger and Jaspers carried the most extreme individualistic, petty bourgeois aristocratic relativism and irrationalism to their farthest logical limits. They ended up with an ice age, a North Pole, a world become empty, a senseless chaos, a not as man's environment, and a despair about oneself and one's inescapable loneliness was the inner content of their philosophy. They thus provided an accurate picture of what was widely going on within the German intelligentsia at the end of the 20s and the start of the 30s. But they did not stop at description. Their account was at the same time interpretation, an exposition of the meaninglessness of any action in this world. Their partisan attitude is manifest in the fact that they related the negative features of what they called the world exclusively to democratic society, and that, on the eve of the crisis and during it, was tantamount to a decisive party press. For it deepened the general mood of despondency among broad sections of the German bourgeoisie, above all, its intellectuals, sidetracked potential rebellious tendencies and thus afforded significant assistance, in a negative way, to aggressive reaction. If fascism could inculcate a more than benevolent neutrality in broad sections of Germany's intelligentsia, this was due in no small measure to the philosophy of Heidegger and Jaspers. In this context it matters hardly at all how both of them personally responded to the Hitler movement, particularly as neither was to become so disloyal to the hypotheses and conclusions of his own thinking as really to make a stand against Hitler. The fact, therefore, that Heidegger emerged as an overt fascist, whereas Jaspers could not go so far for purely private reasons, and for a while, as long as a leftist climate seemed to prevail, used his odium cum dignitate under Hitler to strike an anti-fascist pose after his downfall, does not affect the basic facts of the matter. In the substance of their philosophy, both still paved the way for fascist irrationalism. 7. Pre-fascist and fascist